I'm going to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chair of the Committee of the Whole and Chair of the Council. Today is Thursday, February 1st, 2022. The time is 1:45 in the afternoon, and this hearing is being held in the council chambers, room 500 of the Johnny Wilson Building. There are several members who are participating virtually. And this hearing is being broadcast, I believe, on Channel 13, and it's also available on the council's website, www.dccouncil.gov. The subject of this hearing is fiscal year 2023 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, otherwise known as an ACFR. The purpose of this public hearing is to receive testimony from government witnesses, namely the executive, the chief financial officer, and the inspector general, regarding the results of the fiscal year 2023 ACFR. By law, the ACFR must be released by January 31st, 2024. This document and this hearing are important to understanding the financial health of the district government. Copies of the ACFR may be obtained from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer or the OCFO website. This hearing is part of a series of hearings to be held this winter and spring by the council and its committees in connection with its oversight of the fiscal years 2023 and 2024 agency performance. A full schedule of hearings for all committees is available on the council's website and is published separately in the DC Register. The council's website again is www.dccouncil.gov. Today's hearing is a yearly affair. It's good to see you all again, whereby the council has officially presented the results of the district's annual comprehensive financial report. Following statements by the inspector general, who is actually the one responsible for the audit, the chief financial officer, who is the one responsible for managing the finances that are being audited, and testimony from the city administrator, who is responsible for budgeting and spending the finances that are being managed and audited. There will be at least one 10-minute round each for council members to ask questions. I would like to start by commending the Inspector General, Daniel Lucas, the Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee, and City Administrator, Kevin Donahue, and their teams for a clean audit with no material weaknesses. This is the 27th year that the district has received an unqualified audit opinion, but this was particularly significant. Well, every year is significant, but this was particularly significant because it was a year in which the district transitioned to a new financial system, which 11 months ago, 10 months ago, some people thought was never going to make it. But it looks like the auditors found that it was actually working. The ACFR shows that the fiscal year 23 local fund revenues were $261.7 million higher than projected, and local fund expenditures were $96 million less than budgeted. However, the fiscal year 23 surplus over previously budgeted amounts of $419.5 million was insufficient to fully replenish the locally mandated reserves. This is the first year since 2019 that we have not been able to replenish the mandated reserves. As a result, there are no additional funds to set aside for the Housing Production Trust Fund and capital projects or redirect to new programs. The ACFR also shows that we managed to maintain a general fund balance of $4.9 billion. This $4.9 billion fund balance is not extra money available for spending. Rather, these funds are either restricted, such as $476.7 million for bond escrows to support our $13.6 billion in debt, or the funds are committed, such as the $2.2 billion being reserved for future budgets, or a combination of the two, such as this $1.6 billion in federally and locally mandated reserve funds, or the $650 million tied to special funds, such as DEMPED's Economic Development Special Account, the Department of Environment and Energy's Stormwater Permit Review Fund, or the Housing Authority's Rehabilitation and Maintenance Fund. I want to thank the Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Controller, Kimberly Williams, Inspector General Daniel Lucas, all of their staffs, and our auditors, McConnell and Jones, for their work on the ACFR. With that, I'm going to turn to colleagues for opening statements if they have any. We have a 3-minute clock, and Councilmember McDuffie, you're first.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't think I'll need all 3 minutes. I know you frequently hear people sitting in this position say they're going to be brief. I'm going to try to be brief. I know there are several members who want to give statements. I won't be able to stay the entire time. I have another engagement to get to, but plan to circle back with the witnesses, and want to begin by thanking the witnesses, Inspector General Lucas, Mr. Kozlik, as well as CFO Lee and Deputy CFO Williams, and everybody else who's testifying this afternoon. I'm going to try to modify my statement, not to rehash everything the chairman said. It is, but I do want to recognize that this is the 27th consecutive clean audit of the district's finances, which I think is noteworthy and a testament to our strong financial management and accounting practices over the last several years. This preserves our strong bond rating and gives us the necessary flexibility as we move into a more challenging budget season. Yet I think we all can acknowledge that the district has work to do. The growth and expenditures exceeded our growth and revenues, and we need to fully fund our federally and locally mandated reserves to cover 60 days of operating costs, which I think is going to present some real challenges for us. Several questions come to mind that I hope today's hearing is going to answer, and hopefully the witnesses can focus on some of these questions. As chair of the Council's Committee on Business and Economic Development, I'm pleased to hear that the Offense DC financial statements for fiscal years 22 and 23 both received clean audit opinions. Unfortunately, the fiscal year 2022 audit was delayed by the cyber attack, and the final audit report includes multiple findings regarding insufficient controls, safeguards, and recovery procedures related to that cyber attack. And I hope the witnesses today can address the Events DC audit report and the forensic work that's done to produce them. Also, there were concerns last year that the implementation challenges with the district's integrated financial system could pose challenges to the ACFR audit. I'm interested in how this performed through the audit process and hope the witnesses will speak to this. Finally, I look forward to digging deeper into the district's fiscal year 2023 revenues and expenditures as we prepare for the upcoming fiscal year 2025 budget. The district's financial sustainability is really the bedrock of our efforts to build shared and equitable prosperity for all district residents. And so I want to just again say good afternoon to all my colleagues, which I should have started off with, and say thank you to the chairman again for calling this hearing and to the witnesses for being here.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next is Councilmember Pinto, and then Councilmember Nadeau.
Great. Good afternoon, Chairman. Thank you very much for hosting this annual hearing today. And thank you to our Inspector General, Daniel Lucas, CFO, Glenn Lee, City Administrator, Kevin Donahue, and all of your teams, and Mr. Chuck Kozlik and the independent audit team at McConnell and Jones. I know this audit and report is a huge undertaking every year, and I am very grateful for the time and expertise you all have lent to ensure the district's continued financial health. While our recovery mission continues, for the first time in at least a decade, we experienced a decrease in total revenue of about $115.8 million last fiscal year. While this is less than a 1% decrease in total revenue, it sends a strong and concerning signal that we must remain vigilant about where we are seeing dramatic shifts in our economy and act quickly to reverse those trends. We know that investing in our downtown is absolutely essential to fill our office vacancies and revive our commercial property tax revenue. As we continue to see a decline in commercial property taxes, it's important to note that increases we see in commercial property tax revenue is coming from the residential market. I want to make sure that we're clear about that as we talk about interventions that need to happen. This is an area where the expertise and work of the CFO must be part of the policy conversation so that we can take more aggressive action in the city to turn around the trends that we're seeing with our commercial properties and downtown. We must also continue to invest in tourism as a major source of revenue for the entire district. We saw an increase in sales and use taxes in FY 2023, which was driven by the recovery of our hospitality industry through hotel and restaurant taxes. This was a direct result. Sorry. This This sales and use tax increase is a direct result of the major investments that the council has made to revive the hospitality industry and to support our workers. As we face a changing office landscape, the transition of our underused office buildings to other purposes, we must continue to rely more than ever on our hospitality industry to supplement our tax revenue during these times. This is why it's so important that we continue to invest in the success and growth of our restaurants, hotels, and retail in the coming year. And in order for our downtown to be a destination for residents, businesses, and visitors, we also need to continue our efforts to improve public safety downtown and across the district. All residents and neighborhoods deserve to be safe. And a safer city is most important because our residents deserve it, and it will also help with our recovery efforts. We have to send a very clear and consistent message that we are safe, open, and ready for business. As the chair of the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, I'm very sensitive to the reality that a safer and more secure DC will be built from investments across our entire public safety ecosystem. From ensuring our emergency response workers have the supports and resources to accurately and expeditiously respond to residents in emergencies, supporting our offices to keep our officers, to keep our neighborhoods safe, and investing in our violence interruption, community-based solutions, and better prevention. I'm especially curious today about the findings in the report regarding some of our key public safety agencies, namely WUNS, OUC, and OVSJG, that we saw reductions in their FY 2023 budgets and saw underspending in FY 2023. Our violence interruption specialists are key to our work to drive down crime, and I'm concerned that WUNS actual spending dropped 8% from the revised budget, consequently bringing the agency's spending down by nearly a quarter of the original approved budget. I look forward to discussing some of these spending trends to better understand the factors that drove this underspending and potential implications of it moving forward. So thank you very much again, Mayor Bowser, Inspector General Lucas, CFO Lee, City Administrator Donahue, Independent Audit Team. I'm looking forward to a good discussion this afternoon. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Nadeau, followed by Councilmember Henderson.
I'm going to give everybody a break and not do a statement. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Henderson.
I will join in her lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gray, I believe is online. All right, then I'm going to go to Councilmember Parker.
I do not have a statement, but I am looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank the CFO, City Administrator, and all of our agencies for getting this ACRA done. It's a significant and important undertaking to make sure the city's finances are balanced and in line. I too will have to go in and out because of a previously scheduled briefing. But one of the things I'm hoping to understand, I'm really happy to see a change, a positive change in the population growth in the city. We have seen a lot of out-migration over the past several years. And even before the pandemic, and it seems like we're starting to see some population growth, which I think is a really good sign for the district. There are several good signs for the district, but one that gives me concern that I want to understand a bit more is revenue projections going forward, particularly with respect to the next 5 to 10 years when many downtown office leases will end. And part of our projection has to include predictions on whether those lease renewals will continue at the current rate, which I doubt, or if they will decrease. And if they decrease, what that means for revenue in the city and what other ripple effects that has. So as we start to think about the future of downtown and the future of our economy, one important part of that, one of the most important parts, is projected revenues and projected office vacancy. So I look forward to digging into that a bit so we know where we are now, but also know that where we're going in the years to come. So thank you all again very much, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember White. Councilmember Louis George.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today to provide us with the latest information about the district's financial condition. The information we learned today will lay the groundwork for our upcoming budget season, so it's critical for us to understand our current position. I have to say, given all of the doom and gloom we've been hearing about the upcoming fiscal year 25 budget, I expected this report to be much worse than it is. Admittedly, we've only been reviewing it for a couple of hours, but my initial impression is that this report still shows growth. The growth isn't as strong as it has been, but it's still growth. One significant decrease I did see was in the reduced D taxes. And at least part of that decrease was planned by the council when we decided to sunset a previous increase in that tax. But as I said, I'm here today to listen to the information you're providing so I can better understand our financial picture and decide how to apply that in my plans for the fiscal year 25 budget. There were two things about this report that caught my attention and I guess not in a good way. First, we have underspent the current budget by nearly 10% or 96 million. We're hearing from the executive that we need to redirect emergency rental assistance and SNAP benefit increases when the human support services cluster is going to underspend by nearly 20 million. We're about to pass a very expensive but much needed safety bill, but our public safety and justice cluster of agencies is predicted to underspend by another nearly 20 million. Public education is on track to underspend about another 14 million. I guess I just want to understand how is it how is that possible when we're hearing regularly that we have shortfalls at all the agencies and have implemented a hiring freeze, yet 3 of our most critical agency clusters are underspending by around $55 million. I'll be asking the city administrator to help me reconcile these two facts. Secondly, I'm deeply troubled by the council's auditor's report that the chief financial officer has opted not to include the DC Housing Authority in the fiscal year 2020 or 23 ACFR. To be clear, this was also the practice of the previous CFO. The auditor made a convincing case that the district's financial statements are out of compliance with the Governmental Accounting Standards Board requirements by choosing to exclude the Housing Authority's financial statements from the district's audited financials. So before I finish, I want to correct that the underspending is almost 1%, not 10%. That was, but I want to say that there are still many questions that remain given this report, and I look forward to hearing all of our guests explain this decision and why they believe it is not just the correct decision, but why it's in the best interest of district residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis George. I believe that's all the council members who are present. Before I turn to the witnesses, I do want to emphasize one thing. This is the status of the district government's finances as of last September 30th. I have to say and I suspect others, we kind of sometimes forget and think this is in the moment, but this is actually 4 months ago. But that is how we measure our annual report. With that, who is first? Mr. Lucas?
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Daniel W. Lucas, Inspector General for the District of Columbia. I am pleased to appear at today's hearing to discuss the district's fiscal year 23 annual comprehensive financial report for ACFR audit results. Joining me are staff from the Office of Inspector General and Mr. Chuck Kozlik, audit partner from Connell Jones, contracted by the OIG to independently audit the district's financial statements. First, the OIG is responsible for entering into a 5-year contract with an independent auditor to audit the district's financial statements annually. Per the OIG's contract, the independent auditors are responsible for issuing an audit opinion on the district's overall ACFR, issuing audit opinions for 10 district organizational units, funds, and programs, and reviewing opinions issued by 7 third-party auditors hired by their respective district organizational units, funds, and programs. We oversee the day-to-day ACFR audit contract administration to ensure it comports with applicable contractual requirements and budget. The FY23 ACFR audit process began in April 2023 and continued through the OIG's release of the FY23 ACFR audit opinion yesterday. During this time, the OIG chaired the ACFR Audit Oversight Committee, which which met periodically with the district's independent auditors, the Executive Office of the Mayor, the DC Council, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and other district management officials. The OIG's Aqua Committee ensures the Aqua contract deliverables are within scope and schedule. The Aqua Committee also serves as the mechanism to adjudicate any issues impeding a successful Aqua audit. Considerable time and resources into the district's Aqua audit, not only from the OIG, the independent auditors and OCFO, but all district agencies who are asked to timely provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence to the district's independent auditors. Last year, the University of Illinois Chicago's Government Finance Research Center and the Merit Research Services ranked the district first in U.S. states and territories for audit timeliness between end of fiscal year and date of the independent auditor's report. As the study noted, timely audit reporting is essential for credit evaluation and proper pricing in the municipal bond market and is an important indicator of good governance and stewardship. On behalf of the OIG, I wish to extend my appreciation to all agencies and professionals who have played a role in ensuring an on-time Aqua audit. Next, I'd like to discuss the district's 23 Aqua audit results. As reported, the district's overall FY23 Aqua audit received an unmodified or clean audit opinion. McConnell Jones also issued 10 unmodified or clean audit opinions for 10 organizational units, funds, and programs. Additionally, 7 third-party audits were all reviewed by McConnell Jones, received unmodified or clean audit opinions. In addition to the financial statement audit opinions, government auditing standards require McConnell Jones to communicate to those charged with governance and management any deficiencies in internal control identified during the audit of the district's financial statements. For FY23, McConnell Jones identified a significant deficiency at the district-wide Aqua level, and a third-party auditor identified a significant deficiency at the district's 457B deferred compensation plan. McConnell Jones also identified 11 control deficiencies at the district-wide Aqua level and 4 control deficiencies at the individual organizational unit, fund, and program level. These control deficiencies have been communicated in 4 management recommendation reports issued by the Office of Inspector General. Mr. Kozlik will be able to discuss these Aqua audit findings in greater detail during his presentation. A list of all Aqua audit reports the OIG has released is included as an attachment to my testimony and are available on the OIG's website. In conclusion, thank you for the Aqua Committee members for your dedication over the last several months. An on-time Aqua audit delivery could not occur without the OIG's talented professionals who are collectively responsible for interagency coordination and contract procurement, administration, and oversight. I would also like to acknowledge representatives from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, the Office of the City Administrator, for their continuous support during this year's Aqua audit process. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Kozlik to provide an overview of the FY23 Aqua audit results.
Thank you, Inspector General, and good afternoon. My name is Chuck Kozlik. I'm the lead engagement partner and a member of the McConnell Jones Fully Integrated Audit Team that conducted the independent audit of the District of Columbia's annual comprehensive financial report, or the ACFR. This was done for the fiscal year ended September 30th, 2023. Also here with me today is Mark Schwartz from my team, who worked with us on the audit and is the partner in charge of our Washington, D.C. office. Our firm, McConnell Jones, is the independent auditor of record for the ACFR for the year ended September 30th, 2023. We would like to thank the chair and the council members for allowing our team the opportunity to present our audit results today. It's this. I'm pleased to report that we have issued an unmodified or clean audit opinion on the district's financial statements included in the 2023 ACFR. Unmodified opinions were also issued resulting from the audits of 10 McConnell Jones audited organizational units, funds, and programs of the district. We also note that the financial statements of an additional 7 organizational units, funds, and programs of the district received unmodified opinions on their financial statements as well. During our audits, we identified no material weaknesses in internal control, but we did identify one significant deficiency in internal control at the district ACFR level, which was reported in the district's report on internal control over financial reporting, commonly referred to as the Yellow Book report. We also identified 11 control deficiencies that didn't rise to the level of a significant deficiency. Those were reported in the district's management letter. We identified one significant deficiency in internal control that was reported in the 457B Deferred Compensation Plans Yellow Book report. And 4 control deficiencies were identified and included in 3 standalone management letters for the University of the District of Columbia, the Health Benefits Exchange, and the Home Purchase Assistance Program. During our audits, we identified no instances of fraud, no instances of material noncompliance with laws and regulations. We received the full cooperation of management, and we had no past audit adjustments that we considered to be material to the financial statements. This slide identifies the 10 McConnell Jones audited organizational units, funds, or programs. Each of these entities received a standalone audit of their respective financial statements and an unmodified opinion. Slide 4 shows the 7 organizational units, funds, and programs which were audited by third-party audit firms hired by management or the board of each respective entity. As part of our procedures under the Act for Audit, we provided group audit instructions and expectations. We met with these auditors and reviewed their work and their conclusions reached, and noted that each received an unmodified opinion on their financial statements. Slide 5 provides the detail behind the findings identified during our audits. First item being the significant deficiency in internal control at the district level. It has to do with the handling of purchase card transactions and how they were recorded in the district's DIFs, or the District Integrated Financial System. Next, you can see the control deficiencies identified and reported in the district's management letter. I won't go into each of these. However, generally speaking, you could group these into issues in the areas of procurement, purchase cards, some instances of non-compliance with the Quick Payment Act, segregation of duties issue with regard to diffs in the IT system, and an HR-related exception. Next, on slide 7, you can see the significant deficiency reported in the 457B plans Yellow Book report. And below that, you can see the description of the 4 control deficiencies reported in the UDC, HBX, and HPAP management letters. Slide 8 provides an illustration of the progress made by the district year over year in remediating prior year findings and implementing our recommendations to management. You can see here that 25 findings were identified in the fiscal year 2022 engagement, and 21 of those were remediated or fully implemented by the end of the district's fiscal year 2023. 4 of those 25 prior year findings, however, were not fully implemented. You can see here on slide 9 a little bit of the detail behind the 4 findings that were not fully implemented. You can see that management was still in the process of implementing our recommendations as of 9/30/2023 over at UDC and rolling out an IT risk management framework. At the Department of General Services, we noted that they were not yet complete in rolling out an automated system for tracking leases. In addition, there were 2 prior year recommendations at the Office of the Chief Technology Officer that were not fully implemented. Each of these 4 improvements are expected to be implemented in fiscal year 2024. Slide 10 begins our required communications. It was our responsibility to audit the district's ACFR in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards and to provide reasonable, not absolute assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatement. It's management's responsibility to select and implement the appropriate accounting policies and it was our responsibility as auditors to review management's application of the significant accounting policies. And we have determined that those policies were acceptable. Slide 11, there were no proposed audit adjustments individually or in the aggregate having a significant effect on the district's financial reporting process. We identified no instances of fraud or material noncompliance with laws and regulations. There were no material weaknesses identified in internal control, no material inconsistencies noted with other information contained in the audited financial statements, no disagreements with management on financial accounting or reporting matters, no serious difficulties encountered in performing the audit, and no major issues discussed with management. Slide 13, as part of our procedures at the completion of the audit, we received a management representation letter that was signed by the mayor, the CFO, and the controller. We're unaware of any consultations by management with other outside accountants. During our client acceptance process and throughout the audit, we performed procedures to ensure our independence of the district. And lastly, our firm performed no non-attest services for the district during the course of the engagement. The last slide provides a heads up with regards to accounting pronouncements and current projects of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB. Management will need to implement the first two pronouncements, 99 and 100, during the fiscal year 2024, and statements number 101 and 102 during fiscal year 2025. This concludes my prepared remarks, and we're happy to respond to any questions you may have about our fiscal year 2023 independent audit of the district. And I'll also hand it over to Glenn, the CFO.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Kozlik. We're going to turn it next to our CFO, Glenn Lee.
Good afternoon. Chairman Mendelson, Mr. McDuffie, and members of the Committee of the Whole. I am Glenn Lee, Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. I am with you today to report and discuss the fiscal year 2023 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, otherwise known as the ACFR. With me today is Kimberly Williams, Deputy CFO for the Office of Financial Operations and Systems. She's our controller, as well as other members of the OCFO executive team who will assist in answering your questions. Although fiscal year 2023 presented fiscal challenges, the district's financial health remains strong due to our collective discipline and sound financial management practices. Continued adherence to these practices will be especially necessary going forward as the district confronts post-pandemic economic realities throughout the financial plan period. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the hard work, collaboration, and cooperation of our many partners across the district who have contributed to the successful outcome of fiscal year 2023, including the city administrator and the inspector general, for working with my office to produce this report. We will continue to collaborate with the city administrator and agency program staff to ensure that audit findings are effectively remediated. But I'd also want to especially recognize and congratulate the staff of the OCFO. As has been mentioned, in fiscal year 2023, my team led the implementation of a system enterprise financial system, the District Integrated Financial System, or DIFS. Implementation of such systems is an extremely complex and difficult endeavor at which many jurisdictions have failed. Although much work remains in our efforts to routinize new processes and fully perfect the use of the system, I am extremely proud that we were able to close the government's books, complete the annual financial audit, and prepare and issue the fiscal year 2023 ACFR without delay, and received an unmodified clean opinion. In light of these changes that have occurred over the last year, these are remarkable accomplishments, and I do appreciate council members making note of that. My presentation this afternoon will cover the highlights of the district's fiscal year 2023 results, after which I am happy to respond to any questions you have. All right, so let's move to the slides. As we noted, we have a 27th consecutive clean opinion. Our retirement and OPID trusts are well-funded, and we'll describe those toward the end of the presentation. Ratings for general obligation and income tax bonds remain very strong. Those are the primary sources of our capital funding. Federally and locally mandated reserves equal 51 days of working capital to operate the government and respond to unplanned events. And as has been mentioned, Events DC's fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 financial statements received unmodified clean audit opinions. And that's notable because, as has been mentioned, with the cyber attack they received in fiscal year 22, it compromised their ability to fully complete their analysis to the standards of our auditor for fiscal year 22. That was so noted in our last year's ACFR, and this year I'm very pleased that we are beyond that point. All right, revenues. General fund revenues for fiscal year 2023 were $13.3 billion. The most important source of our revenues are the different income taxes, and this would be both personal income taxes as well as our various corporation or franchise taxes. The next revenue that I'd like to point out is property taxes, which yielded about $2.9 billion or 22% of overall general fund revenue. As you look back at this slide in the last 4 or 5 years, you'll see that property taxes, in fact, are a smaller share of general fund than they have been in the past. And that is because of the issues that have been mentioned here with the struggles with commercial property in the district. Next slide, please. Expenditures. The district had $12.3 billion in expenditures. The largest commitment of district resources of our general fund resources is to the public education system, both charter schools as well as DCPS and OSSI, of course. The next largest commitment of resources is to our human support services cluster of $2.5 billion. Of course, the most important is the Medicaid supplement that we provide as a jurisdiction. Operations and infrastructure consumes 10% of our expenses. The largest commitment there is our WMATA's support, and public safety was about $1.6 billion or 13% of general fund spending. I'd like to talk a little bit about our revenues. This slide describes year-over-year changes in key revenues for our local component of general fund. So generally our revenues that are the most fungible to your budgeting process. Looking at the graph, you can see with the blue bars, those revenues who grew relative to the prior year. So sales and use tax, that figure of 179 million reflects the fact that we received 175 million more than we did in fiscal year 2022. The largest and most important growth factor is our hospitality industry or industries, where there was a substantial growth in those areas, leading sales tax overall. Our next largest revenue stream that grew from the prior year is non-tax revenues, which is a bit of a generic name, but there's one issue here that was really important. Because of very high interest rates and large cash balances, the district received substantially more interest earnings on our cash balances than we did the prior year. And we are well positioned in the market to manage our cash resources effectively, nimbly, to take advantage of opportunities that fit within our policy. And as a result, we earned substantially more for general fund in that purpose. The next revenue is income taxes. The real driver of change from 2022 was very strong withholding for personal income tax, and that withholding reflects wages and salaries primarily. of households, and that grew fairly strong and led overall growth in our income taxes. Property taxes were up a little bit, and that had to do with residential properties, not commercial. And then, of course, you see the large red bar that would reflect a year-over-year decline in deed and estate taxes of about $256 million. The primary reduction in revenue had to do with deed taxes. There's a couple of areas that are important there to understand. The first is that overall the economy is slowing, so there's fewer real estate transactions, which triggers the payment of these taxes. But also, as was mentioned by Council Member Louis George, I believe, we perceived there was an anticipation of larger property owners not to sell or have transactions prior to October 1st of calendar year 23, because that's the time where rates reduce. So we believe there were a lot of property owners anticipated that and held back on our sales or their purchases. Now I'd like to compare our actual revenues relative to our forecast, because on the margin, this is what's more important for our budget planning purposes. This would reflect just strictly our local most fungible revenues again. Our original forecast was 9.69 or basically $9.7 billion for fiscal year 23. We had two notable adjustments. The first was in September of 2023. We increased our estimate by 178, almost 179 million. And we published that and briefed many of you on that development. And then in our December forecast, we increased our estimate for revenues by another $83 million. So overall, our revenues provided 262 million roughly over what we originally anticipated for fiscal year 2023. The drivers are many of the same issues revenues that we talked about, those that were year-over-year drivers. And just starting from the top again, income taxes, again, for both business and individuals. The main driver there was withholding or personal income tax on wages and salaries earned by households. Again, non-tax outperformed. The vast majority of this overperformance relative to our forecast had to do with our interest earnings on our cash balances. Sales tax overperformed, again, driven by the hospitality industry. And deeds and estate tax, of course, while we anticipated a large reduction, we missed the mark. It was actually more significant than we anticipated. Relatively small changes in real property. Again, that was affiliated with residential, not commercial. So overall, $262 million more than the original forecast. Let's talk about spending. This looks at our local and dedicated portions of general fund. Our revised budget was 11.7, so that's adopted plus all the adjustments made mid-year through either reprogramming or supplemental or other adjustments. The total budget was 11.7 billion. Spending was $96 million less than that, for an underspend of about 0.8%. This is actually pretty remarkable in that if you look at underspending in the last several years, generally it's in the range of about 2% underspending. Last year, we reported 3.8%, but there was a commitment against a large portion of that. So in effect, it was about 2% year over year, savings in fiscal year 2022. Fiscal year 2023, it's less than 1%. So this is a very low number relative to typical. Composition of our local surplus. Nonetheless, we did receive more revenues and we had less expenses. Overall, the budgetary surplus, it's reported in the ACFR, is $816.6 million. Now, the financial plan anticipated that we would bring in 397 million specifically, but about 400 more than we would spend. So that was part of the plan. We knew we would have at least that surplus if everything, the revenues were accurate and spending right up to the appropriation limit. However, we received 419 million more than that in surplus. Again, having to do with $262 million more in revenue and $96 million fewer expenses and a handful of other adjustments. So let's see how our performance ended up in terms of our fund balances. Now, I'd like to widen the aperture and describe our overall general fund, which not only includes our local fund, but also our local component, but also dedicated taxes and special revenues. What this particular chart does is it compares our fund balances by these different reserves between 2023 and 2022. First, our federally mandated reserves. We are up by $57 million. Largely, that reflects the fact that because the limits on those or the replenishment amount is a set percent of total spending. As our spending went up in 23 relative to 22, we have more to put into those funds to fully replenish them. So that's generally the reason why there's an increase. Locally mandated reserves were just under $1 billion. That's a little bit less than the prior year. Our debt service reserves are up a little bit. They reflect our upcoming debt service payments, so they can vary from year to year. The reserves for future budget are up substantially. Again, these are set-asides for future years, specifically primarily 24 through 27. I'll talk about that in a minute. Reserved for other purposes, these are particular set-asides that have been legislated of unspent resources. But as the chairman pointed out, there were no resources this year in the Housing Production Trust Fund or PAYGO as a result of the general fund fund balance calculation process. I believe last year, as you can see, there was about 220 in each. So the next chart is a pie chart that describes the same information. And I think it better illustrates a main point I want to make, and that is that the reserve for future budget is $2.2 billion, not quite half of all of our reserves. The reality is this money will be spent by the end of the fiscal plan, the financial plan, by 2027, by design. This is part of our budget planning process. So if everything comes to pass as we expect, we know our fund balances will be about half of what they are today by design. And however, that makes the rest of our fund balances ever more critical to maintain the district and its on an ongoing basis. So let's talk about the federally and locally mandated reserves. We have fully replenished the federally mandated emergency reserve, as well as the federally mandated contingency. And you can see the dollar amounts there, 184 and 369 million. However, there was not enough overperformance in the fiscal year 2023 of the general fund to fully fund the fiscal stabilization reserve as we anticipated. And the cash flow reserve also was not fully funded. And the difference in the cash flow is not use, but rather it too is pegged to a percent of spending. And that percent is that dollar amount is higher, of course, than it was in fiscal 22. And so there is a natural growth that has to occur. We didn't have enough resources in the normal process of funding these or replenishing these funds to increase cash flow up to its fully replenished mark under district code. Altogether, these balances reflect 51 days of capital or of spending needs. We fully expect that through the fiscal year 24 budget adjustments that you will do during the budget process, as well as in fiscal year 25, we will fully replenish these funds. Pension and post-employment benefits. This describes the two our post-employment benefit packages in two large groups. The first is the defined benefit retirement system. And in particular, it's three different components of that. The retirement system supporting police, former police officers, former firefighters, and former teachers. In general, together, those funds are fully funded. And you can look over to the right side of the chart, you see a figure of 99.5%. What that means is we have enough assets on hand to pay all of our liabilities virtually. 99.95% is an extremely good position to be in. Relative to our peers around the country, this is at the top of the class. So effectively, we do not have a financial drag with retirements. OPEB, which is a much smaller responsibility, it's generally related to post-employment health benefits. It, however, is roughly 10% underfunded. It was last year. We're making some progress. There's a very specific plan to fully fund this, and your financial plan for 24 through 27 anticipates fully funding the requirement in order to get the OPEB fund back to 100%. It will take roughly 15 years unless there's extraordinarily positive market development, but that's per the policies of the district. So it's not a net new drag to relative to your current financial plan to fully fund OPEB. In conclusion, we are very strong financially. We're certainly as strong as most, if not all, other major cities, but there are signs of warning. We all know this. Knowing right now that roughly $2.2 billion of our fund balance is needed to balance the budget over the next 4 years is part of the plan. You all knew that. We all knew that, but it shows that we're not accumulating ever more. And so we're in for some tight times. And I think we can begin to see that with the fiscal year 2023 ACFR. Nonetheless, our conditions right now are very strong.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members, and staff of the Committee on the Whole. My name is Kevin Donahue, and I have the honor of serving as the Mayor's City Administrator. I'm also joined today by Jenny Reed, the Director for Office of Budget and Performance Management, who will also be here to be able to answer questions as well. I have a short presentation. I do want to start with a few words to provide some context and really to reiterate the Mayor's unwavering commitment to responsible financial stewardship of the city's resources. I also want to highlight that the next few years will be pivotal for the district. I think we all know that. Cities around the world are not the same after the pandemic, including ours. And we've had the benefit of a historic investment of federal funds, which is really a once-in-a-generation event of money that will not continue after this fiscal year. And at the same time, we know that the decisions that we make over the next few months for this upcoming budget and really next year's budget too, will plant the seeds of what the city looks like for a generation to come. And I look forward to working with each of you in helping to shape that vision. All of us, the executive and the council, are going to have some hard decisions to make in the upcoming budget. That'll be the reality for us as we complete the budget while maintaining our unwavering commitment to sound fiscal management and stewardship. Now, I'll begin my formal presentation and I will go through this relatively quickly for the benefit of getting to questions. Go to the next slide. The CFO already touched on this, and so I won't reiterate each item here. I do want to highlight how remarkable it is that we're on to our 27th consecutive clean audit. Our retiree and pension funds, as you just heard, remain robust. Our bond rating remains strong, and we have 51 days of cash on hand. I do want to highlight a point the CFO made, and it's the extraordinary amount of work and commitment on the part of everyone involved in doing the audit, including and most notably the CFO staff, in being able to have an audit on time, clean, and be sitting before you now is an extraordinary event if we think about where we were transitioning to a new financial system just about a little over a year ago. If you go to the next slide, I do want to highlight that the investments we've made, both with local funding as well as federal funding, are paying off. And we're seeing that in how well we've recovered. Population continues to grow. Hospitality and tourism is nearly back to pre-pandemic levels, something that we would not have anticipated 2 years ago. Tourism is up. We continue to be an attractive place for residents, businesses, and visitors, and we're opening up more retail, office, residential, hotel, and cultural destinations, and some of which you can see before you on the slide. If you go to the next slide, I do want to talk about and reiterate a point that CFO made, which is that an important part of our financial strategy and stewardship is, in fact, the strength of our reserves. During the pandemic, we utilized almost all of 3 of the 4 reserves. We currently, on this slide, as you can see, are continue to use 3 of the 4 reserves to balance our daily cash needs, balance our current budget, and respond to unforeseen events. Importantly, our emergency reserve remains intact should one arise. It's important to note that our fiscal stabilization reserve used to balance the current year budget is not replenished. It's a tool we can rely upon for our upcoming budget. We'll continue to work with the CFO on prudent management reserves, and that is one in which we would expect to pay back in a mixture of the supplemental and new budget that we submit to the council in March. If you go to the next slide, one reasons for the lack of funds building back up our reserves is really the extraordinary experience that we've had in having the lowest level of agency underspending in a decade. In FY23, district agencies underspent by just $152 million, which is just over 1% of the general fund. This reflects tightening agency budgets, more accurate budget planning, and a focused effort to get dollars out the door. And if you think about how that compares to prior years, it's an understanding of that. We manage tightly in tight budgets, and the underspending is one consequence of that. If you go to the next slide, it illustrates again how low underspending was for both our local and our dedicated taxes. Special purpose revenue funds, also lower than in FY22, often carry larger balances since the revenue collections can vary from year to year. Sometimes money collected from one year can spill over into the next, and you see underspending in both categories. If you go on to the next slide, and I'll spend a little bit more time on this one, this is a line graph that shows the city's overall revenues, and you can see how much it grew over the past few years. You can also see, based on the CFO's forecast with those dashed lines, how it slows considerably. In fact, from FY20 to 22, our revenues grew by an astounding 21%. This allowed us to do many things that produced some of the results you saw in the prior slide. Create new programs, expand programs, help residents, help businesses recover and expand, and deepen our ability to help those most in need. However, that revenue growth is expected to slow significantly, as you can see. This is absolutely going to constrain our ability to launch new programs and expand what we have. The slow growth is also not nearly enough to deal with 2 upcoming major expenses. One was WMATA, that we know to continue to have a robust metro system that serves all of our city. It requires more money. And the other one is to keep up with rising labor costs and personnel costs as we negotiate additional collective bargaining agreements. So we'll be in a new financial reality. If you were to overlay this revenue growth with both inflation and spending increases, you would see that those will also kept up with the revenue growth, and those may also continue beyond the fact that we'll have slower revenue growth. You may still see growth in spending, growth in inflation and growth in some of our labor pressures. On the next slide, you'll see the other reality we feel during FY25 budget formulation is the loss of a tremendous amount of federal funds. More than $8.5 billion in grants was received by district government, WMATA, our hospitals, and our universities. Another $8.3 billion was received and issued as direct payments to residents and businesses. That's over $16 billion in federal aid that we've seen over the past few years. That all comes to an end this September. There'll be no federal stimulus funding available in FY25 to support the programs and services like it has had for the past 4 years. I do want to accomplish one major thing the district did during the pandemic, and that's to work as well as we did, as hard as we did to recover as much federal public assistance reimbursement as possible. Since 2020, our team recovered nearly $1 billion from the federal government for COVID-19 expenses and expenses that dealt with the recovery from COVID-19. This put us 15th among states in dollars recouped, not 15th as a percent of our budgeted population, but 15th overall. We were the 49th largest state, if you consider us the 51st state, but we were 15th in the amount of money we were able to get from the federal government. And I want to acknowledge the work of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, the Office of Contracting and Procurement, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and our own budget team in allowing for this to happen, which enabled us to be able to preserve local programs and expand local programs because we had the foresight and acuity and nimbleness to be able to go after federal dollars. On slide 9, as we look ahead to our comeback, we know there are challenges that will impact the district. We know the federal government's continued use of long-term telework. It continues to have a negative impact on both our office market and private businesses who often mimic what the federal policies are. And the mayor will continue to be the most vocal advocate for bringing federal workers back in person to work on a regular basis to help our downtown businesses benefit from the enhanced crowds. We've talked a bit about a modest fiscal cliff that will be a challenge that lies ahead of us. And our commercial real estate market remains extremely fragile with, from what I understand, 65% of all commercial leases up for renewal over the next 4 years. As we work on our FY25 budget, we must all focus on ensuring an equitable comeback for the district. But let me be clear, this will be the most difficult budget we've had since the recession. I had the honor of working for the mayor during the recession, and I can understand with personal experience what that entails. Before I conclude my presentation, I want to thank the Budget Director, Jenny Reed, and her team, CFO Glenn Lee, Inspector General Daniel Lucas, the independent auditing team of McConnell Jones, and the many, many district agencies and employees who ensured that we're able to have another clean audit. It has taken a tremendous amount of hard work to get us to where we are today, and I commend everyone for this success. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to have me go through this presentation. Both myself and Director Reed are available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. City Administrator. Thank you, each of you, for your testimony. So let's put us on a 10-minute clock for a round. We'll see if there's a second round. There probably will be. I'm going to begin with this question that there's been a lot of discussion about. The Auditor of the District of Columbia has asserted that the district's fiscal year 2022 annual comprehensive financial report should have characterized the district and the DC Housing Authority as a component unit because the district appoints a voting majority of its governing board and the district's operating and capital subsidies establish financial accountability. The fiscal year 23 ACFR characterizes the Housing Authority as a related agency, not a component unit. Can you explain why the Housing Authority should be characterized as a related agency rather than a component unit?
Thank you for the question. The governing body that controls these kinds of decisions is called the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB. GASB has several different criteria that jurisdictions are supposed to evaluate, generally centered around three things. First, the legal relationship. Is there a legal relationship? Second is the nature of the governance between that entity and the prime entity, in this case, the district. And then a sense of the financial commitment and the essentialness of the financial commitment to the satellite agency. And our assessment is that the DCHA does not, in fact, meet the full standards that GASB requires for to be considered a component unit. In particular, we don't believe that there's a legal obligation to our finances for to the Housing Authority, unlike if we had a debt responsibility that we had to pay on behalf of the entity, or whether or not The budget is absolutely controlled by the central agency, let's say as if the housing authority had a director that reported to the mayor and the mayor and through her staff would determine the budget. And so for these and other reasons, we believe, as have my predecessors, have determined that this is not a component unit, but rather a related entity. And we feel very clear and strong about that opinion. I have to say that my past experience, we had a very similar structure and financial commitment relative to a major city and a housing authority, and we made the same call, and that too was audited for years. So we believe that we're justified in the decision. It's consistent with my experience, and after we make our determination, as is true with any of our accounting acts or processes or policies, we then turn it over to the Inspector General and the independent auditor who validate whether or not we're making the correct decision. And I don't know if they have anything to add, but that's, they obviously, in order to have an unmodified opinion, they concurred with our judgment.
So the decision is yours.
I believe that's true under federal officer.
And is there like a checklist that you go through to answer Gatsby's questions, whether
There
it's
is.
related or component?
There is.
And part of the audit is one where the Inspector General, who's actually responsible, is agreeing or disagreeing with you, and the auditor, the independent auditor, is agreeing or disagreeing with you?
Well, to be clear, we make our own judgment, but like the rest of our accounting policies and our actually accounting activity, we hand that over to the auditor for an independent assessment. So I don't want to leave an impression that we work together to come to this position. That's not how it works. We make our decision on this and dozens of other accounting policies, and we provide that to the Inspector General and the independent auditor for their own assessment.
Mr. Lucas, you agree, disagree?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. In my role in overseeing the audit, it's not my role to agree or disagree with the CFO's characterization. That is the role of the independent auditor. My role is to make sure they have the information they need in order to provide their independent opinion on the CFO's characterization.
But you're comfortable with how this is?
Yes, I'm comfortable with how the process played out. The CFO provided the independent auditor their assessment. The independent auditor reviewed that and drew their conclusion.
Mr. Kozlik, since we're busy talking about you?
Yeah. Again, management made the decision and they provided the support to us. We reviewed it, just like we review the support for, that determination for every component unit and every related entity. Again, they're all described in note 1 to the ACFR in the summary of significant accounting policies. And we agreed with management's assessment. That's why there's no change.
Okay, I want to ask about the reserves. The fiscal stabilization reserve was used in fiscal year 21 and 23 to balance the budget. In fiscal year 21, it was fully repaid. But as reflected in the FY 23 ACFR, the ACFR that's before us, it was only 12% filled this time around. Now that's as of September 30th. This is the first year since 2019 that the district will not have 60 days of cash on hand. The current fiscal year 24 through 27 financial plan does not show replenishment of this account. How will the replenishment of the fiscal stabilization reserve be handled, be resolved?
The practice of the district is to refill these reserves with overperformance in the budget. So in other words, revenue over forecast or spending less than the appropriations. That's the practice. This year, there was not enough resources from overperformance in revenue or underspending to fully fund these reserves or replenish these reserves. As a result, we have then a requirement under law for the local reserves that either in this fiscal year 24 or in fiscal year 25, that there be affirmative budget actions to set aside these resources in order to fund these completely. fund these two reserves completely. So it's our expectation, based on current law, that that's the steps that will be taken.
So your view, you said expectation, but your view is that we're required, we, the district government, are required to replenish those reserves.
Yes, sir.
And is the amount that's required, do we know what it is? I don't have the table right in front of me. Is it on that table?
Yes. It's over $300 million. $322 million.
$322 million.
Yes, sir.
And we have 2 years to do that.
Yes.
Do you know when we were last at 51 days?
I'm sorry?
Do you know when we were last at 51 days?
I believe it was in the late teens, and we were at that point receiving surpluses that that adequately replenished up to the 60 days pretty quickly. I don't anticipate that those days of large surpluses was possible.
So I had heard, I think somewhere like 20, since 2018, 2019, we've been at 60 days.
Yes,
I'm guessing that means prior to 2018 or 2019,
yes.
we were below 60 days. How is it that fiscal stabilization got depleted? As of September 30th, it was what, at 12% funded?
Yes. As of September 30th, yes.
How did that happen?
Well, it was a resource available to balance the budget in the overall financial plan for fiscal year 24 and 20 through 27. Of course, as you know, at play is the current fiscal year at the time, which is fiscal year 23 as well. So it was part of the package that council approved.
So basically, we budgeted that
As-
with the expectation that revenues would, as every year, be high enough that they would replenish it. And how is it the cash flow got depleted? Is that just a moment
Well,
of time?
That dollar amount reflects the difference between the limit in fiscal year 22 or the full replenish amount and the full replenishment in fiscal year 23. That replenishment amount is based on spending in that year. Spending went up, and since spending went up, the limit or the amount that needs to be in the fund to be compliant with law goes up automatically. So as revenues go up, expenditures go up.
So it wasn't so much that cash flow was
That is
spent, it's that the reserve requirement has gone up.
right. And to be clear, we do use cash flow periodically during a fiscal year as is authorized, the CFO office does, but we fully replenished what we used. This difference is just simply the difference between fiscal year 22's limit and fiscal year 23's limit. And there was not enough surplus resources to fund that.
I have some more questions on reserves, but I'm out of time. Let me turn to colleagues. Councilmember Pinto, do you have questions?
I do. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for those very helpful presentations. I want to start with you, CFO Lee, regarding the impact of our commercial property values, especially in the downtown area. As you mentioned, in FY 2023, our property taxes made up 22% of all district revenue, which was a smaller share than in previous years, driven by dropping commercial property values. What share of our property tax revenue do you estimate came from commercial properties in our downtown area or our central business district? And how does that share compare to the previous fiscal years?
Commercial, I don't have those specific numbers at top of mind, but what I can tell you, and we can look it up here in a minute and provide you that information. What I can tell you is that our peak collection on commercial properties occurred in, I believe it was fiscal year 2021. And in reality, and also in our forecast moving forward, we expect the total value of commercial properties to decline to the point that we'll collect between 250 to $300 million less per year in property tax than we did from that peak year, fiscal year, I believe it was 21.
Can
So
you get that number again?
between 250 and $300 million a year less in general fund revenue from property tax on commercial properties. Because of the deterioration of the values of properties.
Okay. And how are you expecting that number to be reflected in the next several years?
As that's inherent in our revenue forecast for property taxes. So you'll see that the property tax overall growth will, for the, between now through 2027, probably further than that, is substantially less year over year than it was during the 2000 teens. And so that's how you'll see it, a very, very slow growing revenue stream. And with residential properties still increasing in value, therefore there's relatively more property tax each year from residential, but commercial properties, overall, their values are declining over that time period. So year after year, we have less and less revenue from commercial properties.
Okay, and are you all able to follow up with us about the portion of the commercial property taxes that are generated from downtown properties?
From downtown properties? I believe so. Certainly all commercial properties, but yes, we can follow up with that. That'll be quick. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. As we look across the financial plan, projected office vacancies have also been revised upwards. What is your projection for the impact that this will have on commercial property taxes across the financial plan?
More vacancies means less income to property owners, to developers, property owners, which then means there's less value to properties. So overall, our property assessed values then are declining to reflect the less economic value of the properties overall.
Right, but can you speak in numeric terms of what you're expecting to see?
In a assessed value,
Yes.
we're
Well,
expecting.
value and ultimately impact on our revenue on how much.
Right. And so, as I mentioned before, the impact on our value is that we will receive between 250 to up to 300 million by fiscal year 2027, less in general fund than we received from commercial properties in fiscal year 2021. So think of it this way, that's between 250 to 300 million dollars less per year in general fund than had property values stayed static over the same time period.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. In terms of Capital One Arena, how much of the district's property tax and sales revenue in FY 2023 came directly from Capital One Arena? And how much property sales and tax revenue can be attributed, or how do you estimate this, for its impact on the surrounding area?
Well, we can provide what public information we have on direct sales tax affiliated with the facility itself. It's very difficult to determine in the longer run the implications of fewer events at the facility, fewer 80 basically less events at the facility. It really depends on what the property will be used for. Perhaps there's other events that can take its place that'll bring the same buying power into downtown, or there could be other adjacent development that would offset that loss.
Right.
So
But-
it really.
but I'm not asking, sorry, I don't mean in the future for what it could be. I just mean for what we know now about the numbers.
Right. We don't have the numbers for the facility with me, but we can provide those direct for numbers that are publicly disclosable. We can provide that to you. Yes.
Okay, and is it something that you can estimate the tangential impacts of other sales tax for local restaurants and bars, for instance, that are around the arena?
Yes, rather indirectly, but it's hard to know specifically the number of people coming into downtown as that only are because of that to the extent that they wouldn't otherwise spend in the downtown area or in the region. So estimating the economic impact of a dynamic area like that is pretty difficult because you're saying everything else is the same. Let's assume what is directly resulting from the activity there. That's a difficult thing to estimate because not everything else is equal. There could be other events going on that can affect your numbers. So, right.
Yeah,
Right.
and of course, and that's why these things are estimates and usually
Right.
in ranges of impact. But as we grapple with the very urgent need to invest in Chinatown and Gallery Place and downtown, I think it's important for everybody to be on the same page of the type of investment that it's going to need to offset what we're currently receiving as a district through direct and indirect benefit of the arena. But we can move on. So in terms of tourism and hospitality, we saw a 21.9 million tourists in calendar year 2022, and most of those were from domestic tourism. And I know that this is a trend that has changed over the last several years following the pandemic as well. And this has also helped offset some of the slowing revenue growth that we've seen from our commercial property tax revenues. How are you projecting sales and use tax to change over the financial plan? And how are you looking at the trends in tourism and hospitality to inform that projection?
We forecast independently several different industries, including the hospitality industry. And we look at recent experience as well as both national and regional economic estimates, and effectively do a statistical correlation to see what that trend looks like relative to macroeconomic information that we have. To your point, my understanding is that international visitors tend to spend a lot more, dramatically more, sometimes up to 5 to 10 times more than domestic tourists. We understand that, and certainly across the board, we suffered dramatically in that industry as a result of COVID and the shutdown. So not having the same mix as you're pointing out, and that's what we hear as well, of as many as or a higher percentage of our visitors being international, probably is dampening the rate of growth that we're experiencing. Difficult to estimate exactly what that is, but there's no doubt that it's dampening the growth. We look forward to the resolutions of issues that would encourage more international guests to come into our district. And a lot of those, as you well know, have to do with visa issues for international guests and so forth that are beyond our control.
Okay, thank you for that. We only have a couple seconds left, but I just wanted to ask about the financial outlook and Moody's comments last fall. Will this affect our ability to raise bond revenue across the financial plan?
No, I think what you're referring to is that Moody's changed our outlook of our AAA rating from stable to negative. And they attributed that change exclusively to the issues that our federal partners are having with their budget deliberations that are obviously well in the press. We all know extremely well. And
that's due to our overdependence on the federal government?
No, rather they feel because we're relatively closer in terms of our governance and financial relationship to the federal government and to Congress, we inherently had more risk than other jurisdictions would have. And
you don't mean closer proximity, you mean closer. Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Okay, I'll stop. We'll come back next round. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Nadeau.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, everybody, for your testimony today. I have some questions regarding a few parts of the audit. that relate to the Office of Contracts and Procurement. Finding 2023-007, which is controls over emergency and sole source procurements are not operating effectively. Regarding that finding, in what way does the lack of proper review and approval of emergency procurements increase the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse in the procurement process? Open it up to whoever likes to answer.
So yes, we look at various procurements, whether it's sole source, emergency, and the idea being that we want to make sure that the proper methods were used as required by law. And again, we found a couple instances around the district, not just finding number 7, but others where the DNF form that's completed for the type of procurement method that was used was not followed or was not signed or dated, things like that. So there is some tightening up of internal controls that we think needs to happen in this area. I will say that the number of exceptions we identified during our audit were less than in prior years. So that is, an indication that things might be improving in this area. However, we still did note these exceptions and we drafted a finding accordingly.
And so the question was, in what way can that increase the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse in the procurement process?
It's probably more in the way of, again, just proper procedures not being followed, right? We should have, or the district needs to have proper management reviews happening over these procurements. And if a preparer got it wrong, you would hope that that manager would catch it, as part of the internal control structure and environment around the procurement area.
But why does it matter in the context of having a clean audit?
In these instances, it's to make sure that the district is in fact receiving the goods and services that it's actually purchasing. When you don't have the evidence to confirm that, then there's questions.
Which is where there could be perhaps fraud, waste, or abuse.
Correct.
Very good. Thank you. Should OCP, the Office of Contracts and Procurement, initiate training or awareness programs to ensure that personnel involved in emergency P card transactions are aware of and follow the updated procedures and guidance in the Purchase Card Program Policy and Procedures Manual?
Good
Yes.
afternoon.
Very good. And if so, what kind? So yes, what kind?
What kind of training?
Yeah.
You could simply use our findings to develop training around that, to illustrate to people the importance of following your controls and helping them understand the risks thereof in not following those controls. And they could find themselves in hot water.
I would also like to add, council member, that if you recall from last year's ACFR, that was a specific recommendation from McConnell Jones that we implement that emergency P card training. And I'm sorry, this is really awkward, but
It's okay.
I'm trying to we implement that emergency P card training, and OCP has developed that and begun rolling it out. It's something that we should look at, maybe making sure we're doing on a frequent enough basis, but we did a lot of work, and you will see that the finding from last year related to emergency procurements, we have been able to close this year through a lot of that work.
Very good. But I'm committee chair this year, so I want to know about this year. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, of course, it's all important. So, and we have that oversight hearing coming up. So I invite a report, testimony on how the P card is being rolled out, P card training. Regarding the finding that Office of Contracts and Procurement did not pay vendors in compliance with the Quick Payment Act, OCP responded that because the process changed to DCH SEMA, they believe the recommendations are not applicable. Although all 7 instances involved COVID-19 disbursements, do you see a potential risk that failure to implement these recommendations could lead to similar cases in the future?
Council member, so without looking at the specific transactions, I'll say 2 things. One, in FY 23, part of the reason that we moved expenditures from COVID from OCP to HCMA was the sheer volume of work that they had to do. We felt like we were worried they weren't able to keep up, and we had to make sure to free them up to do other really important procurement work. The other thing that happened is just, as we're implementing a new financial system, there's so much to input and new codes to enter and new processes to follow, that you'll see that finding repeated in a few different places. And I think that in the beginning of the year, we just had a few challenges with delayed payments going out. But as the CFO testified, they have been working around the clock to make sure to improve that so that we are all able to get payments out in a timely manner.
Okay, I'm still getting complaints about vendors being paid in a timely manner. So I think it's something that we need to continue to work on, including, our own projects and things that we're trying to advance together as two branches of government. So in the few minutes I have left this round, some questions for our CFO. I know that our auditor has raised some concerns, and the DC auditor, and I understand OCFO disagrees with some of the DC auditor's conclusions. It hasn't necessarily been made clear why. So let's specifically with the department, the DC Housing Authority, during FY 2022 and FY 23, did the district provide operating and capital subsidies to DC Housing Authority?
Yes, they did.
And in the OCFO's two position statements in 2019 and 2023, why did the OCFO not consider whether the subsidies constitute financial support?
Oh, there we go. I don't believe that's a correct characterization of the issue. It's not based upon whether support was provided. Rather, it's based on whether there's an legal obligation to provide the support. And I think that's a fundamental mischaracterization, misunderstanding.
And is that generally why you're disagreeing with the DC auditor's conclusions?
One of a handful of reasons, yes. Or I characterize it, she's disagreeing with us.
Will OCFO re-examine the status of DC Housing Authority under GASB accounting standards?
If there's a material change in either the governance that's legislated by you all or a particular financial commitment.
Particular financial commitment, you said?
Yes.
Like
So
what?
in particular, if we make a commitment that is then a legal obligation to be paid every year. And there's nuance to that assessment. So it would take a while to work that through. But until then, no, absolutely.
So we don't currently have any financial obligations like what you're describing right now to the Housing Authority?
So currently, we do provide subsidies, as you previously asked. However, we are not legally obligated to provide those subsidies. We are not legally obligated to responsible for any debt that they issue. We don't review and approve their budget. And we don't review and approve the rates that they apply to any of their housing contracts. So therefore, we do not have a financial obligation to DC Housing Authority. That's one of the reasons, that is the main reason why it does not meet one of the 5 criteria of GASB to become a component unit.
If council passes a subsidy into law, isn't that considered a legal obligation?
Not to the entity.
Okay.
It's an obligation that you establish as an expenditure, or rather a limit, but not to the entity.
And what makes, in the final few seconds, what makes the Housing Authority different from other organizations, including UDC and Events DC, that receive subsidies from the district or recognized by the OCFO as part of district's financial reporting entity?
I think many of the items that Ms. Williams just described in terms of control over the budget, having legal authority or responsibilities regarding debt and so forth, is a very different scenario than with the housing authority.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau. Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for your presentation today. I want to start in talking about real property and deed taxes. I think you mentioned in your presentation that our residential tax collections offset our commercial sector collections for real estate property taxes. Does this mean that our residential real properties, which are often the single largest piece of wealth for many of our residents, is maintaining in their value?
In general, residential property values are stagnant to slightly increasing. Dramatically different story occurs with commercial properties that are losing value. It feels like monthly at this point because of the COVID environment, post-COVID world we're in. So yes, residential properties are generally holding their value or increasing.
Okay, so when it comes to the deed taxes, it was very noticeable in your chart. We saw a 40% decline in terms of revenue that was collected from that. Is this attributed mainly to the softening of sale and acquisitions in our market?
We believe there's two reasons. First is the overall economic challenges that are occurring that are softening the entire real estate market, but also we believe many major actors chose to wait to have a transaction until after October 1st of 2023 because of a change in the rates that the district levies on those transactions.
Oh, I see, the sunset you were
Right.
referring to.
That's
Okay.
right.
And so I think I'm about to answer my own question, so I'm gonna skip that. But so I was listening to the news yesterday. The Fed decided not to move anywhere in terms of interest rates. If they were to adjust down because they're seeing a more positive financial picture, would that revise the estimates that you all have in terms of the outlook?
I think inherent in our estimates right now is an expectation that there'll be a slow decline in the federal interest rates that they establish. If there's a much more dramatic decline or a statement to the other saying we don't see any change for a long time, then that's different than what's currently expected in consensus forecasting. So right now, all of our forecasts, and I mean that industry-wide, anticipate a gradual easing of federal interest rates.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
I was, I read in another article, there's a large percentage, especially on residential property owners in the district who are sitting on very low interest rates. And so like if you go on Zillow or Redfin, you're not going to actually see the inventory. I remind my husband, like, no, we're not moving. We have our nice under 4, under 3.5, like heaven help the people who had to purchase homes when it was 7. But I think that this is an important part to the conversation is that some of this outlook is most certainly what's happening externally, things that we don't necessarily control. So that's good to hear. I want to ask a question about the underspending piece. So I look specifically in the human services cluster. I chair the health committee, so that's our bread and butter area. And locally it was about 18.4 million left on the table, which is not a significant number in my opinion. But in terms of federal spending, there was about $278 million that went unspent in FY23 in terms of federal funds. And so I have some questions across the board, but I first want to ask for Mr. Inspector General, how does your office or the audit firm examine the reasons or trends for underspending on federal sources? How do you all examine the reasons or the trends for underspending when it comes to federal sources?
We wouldn't normally look at underspending on federal grants. There is a single audit that's done by another auditor.
Okay.
And it would probably fall more in their review.
Okay. Mr. CFO, do you all look at trends or reasons for underspending? Obviously, there's some grants that are multi-year.
I think the city administrator is best positioned to describe.
Good afternoon, council members. So the large underspending you're seeing in the health and human service area does really have to do with two things. One is that multi-year grant. So often what happens is agencies will load the full amount of the grant, even though it will be spent over 3 years.
Okay.
And we also have some excess budget authority that's in there that wasn't realized. So for example, the largest share of federal grant rollover is in the Department of Health. It's about $140 million. And it's because of expanded grants and increases that are planned to be spent multi-year. There's a good amount in DBH. A lot of that is for our opioid funds that we're working on a spend plan for. And then there's around 20 million in healthcare finance. That is budget authority that it wasn't used, but we have to book it and if we get the expenditures.
Okay. Okay. So, you know, it's interesting that we're having this conversation in the middle that we're also having performance oversight. And it's that you brought up the Department of Behavioral Health, for instance. So yesterday I had my hearing with the Department of Behavioral Health, and I asked specifically regarding some of their federal underspending because they've been flagged by some of the federal agencies in the past for having a significant amount of carryover from year to year, particularly on some things like state opioid funds and some other things. So I asked that team, like, what is the cause here in terms of why we have a delay in getting dollars out the door? And, you know, Mr. CFO, they brought up your office to say that, well, you know, CFO is not uploading our funds in time. We usually don't get our funds uploaded until February. And then once we get the funds uploaded, then we can do the RFP. And then we have to go through the process. And so we don't get the funds out till April. And then our grantees only have until September to spend all the money. What are your thoughts on that?
My initial thought is that I've not been briefed on this as an issue, which means it's not floating up to my senior staff in the human services area. So that's my initial thought. If in fact there is a step in that process that is, for whatever reason, our staff is executing at a slower rate, that's important for us to know, and we will correct that if it's indeed true. I have no basis to know.
Okay. Well, let's follow up on that. Some of this isn't your fault, especially on the local stuff. I have beefs with lots of agencies that they don't start writing the scope of work for a grant until October 1st, even though they've known since May or June that they have the money. And then they blame OCP and CFO of why a grant doesn't even post until February. And if it's a grant for the school year, look, half the school year is already gone. And so I think that's something that we all just kind of need to tighten up on. Is I don't like to give money back, particularly to the federal government, nor do I like to get flagged for underspending, especially in areas where we have a significant amount of need and community on those particular issues.
Can I just add, in some occasions, the grant funding is based on the completion of the ACFR. So if there's budget authority that's tied to carryover funding, that carryover funding sometimes needs to be confirmed by the auditor. And that won't explain every case that may have come up, and we would have to look at specific instances in DBH, but there will probably be some of them for which the process of just validating the carryover was what was probably driving the issuance of an RFP later in the year.
I don't want to pick on them. They're just most fresh in my mind because it came up yesterday. I want to ask really quickly about sales tax. Our sales tax grew by 10%. How is this in comparison to other jurisdictions in terms of, are they seeing a larger rebound in terms of people coming to their jurisdictions and spending money than perhaps we are?
Well, that depends on other jurisdictions regionally. I'm sure we're not behaving, our experience is not substantially different. I can't speak for Atlanta or Dallas or other central cities where, because of population losses, there's still post-COVID recovery that isn't as robust as ours. Appreciate that our hospitality industry is exceptional. We are the nation's capital and draw people here, and for whether it's business or pleasure. So we have that benefit that maybe other jurisdictions are not benefiting from.
Okay. And then in your presentation, you talked about the rebounding labor market. When we first talked, when I was first a council member talking about the ACFR back in 2021, one of the things you all talked about is that upper income individuals help to mitigate some of the revenue loss from. I could be nice because he's not here. And I'm going to do that because Councilmember Parker is sitting next to me. We'll come back.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in. And thank you all for your work in putting together this report. Mr. Lee, I'm going to come back one more time with the DCHA and the component unit thing. And I know we've addressed this several times, but can you elevate what makes DCHA different than other component units, i.e. UDC, in your perspective?
A couple of things that are important to us. We do not have a legal obligation to finance their deficits or provide other support. And I'm simplifying the concept, but basically we don't have a requirement under law to pay them a specific amount of money for an obligation, like a contract to build a building or something like that on an ongoing basis, not one time, but ongoing. We do not control their budget. That's another critical issue. And as opposed to UDC or Events DC, we do control their budget.
Okay. Mr. City Administrator, I wanted to come to the unaddressed findings noted by McConnell Jones. What is the executive's plan to address the unsatisfied findings? I noted several of them dealt with technology or data tracking, and the district has been victim of data breaches in the past.
Yep. So thank you for that question. So there's the 3 outstanding findings related to DGS and then 2 with Octo. And all of those involve multi-year plans that need to happen before the finding can be closed. So I think the auditors in the briefing that we had noted that we are making progress towards them, and we are on track, but they are 2 to 3 year projects before they can be done. And since they're not closed, they remain as findings.
And when you say on track to satisfy them in the fiscal year 24, ACFR?
I believe for Octo, for DGS, it should be 24. For Octo, it'll be 24 or 25. They're 2 to 3 year risk remediation plans, but we are actively working on them. And until they're actually in place, they can't close the finding.
Okay, thank you. Mr. CFO, I wanted to come to D taxes. I know the D tax sunsetted at the end of the fiscal year, and you suggested that perhaps people held off on making transactions because they knew that sunset was approaching. To date, have we rebounded or have we seen revenue for D taxes tick back up? And if so, to what extent?
We anticipated a rebound, and in general, we're closer to our forecast, but appreciate that there's also the overall economic stress that's happening. So it's hard for us to split the 2 different effects. They both have a downward effect on these taxes, just the difficulty, lower values, that commercial properties are worth, as well as this one-time change in the rate that.
And when you say we are approaching our projections, are those projections aligned with previous revenues, or are they different?
They anticipate a bump back up in sales that are subject to this tax.
Got it.
So we're only a quarter into the year, and so it's early to say whether we're actually on track or not. I mean, we can count the dollars, but it's early in the year.
What I'm getting at there is, and you may recall, I was attempting to extend the tax versus allowing it to sunset. And if part of the pushback that I heard was, well, this is going to have a negative impact on transactions. And so I was trying to get at whether or not we've seen that play out or whether there are other reasons for the behaviors we're seeing in the market. So
Well, as I said, there's two driving
Understood.
issues. So we are generally tracking the forecast, which anticipates a bump up, but there's the other issue, of
Yes.
course, what's happening in the economy. So it's
for underspending, and I know this has come up several times, we're at about 0.8%. Is there an acceptable range and or a recommended range for underspending? And if so, where are we in relation to that?
I'm sorry.
And by acceptable range, I mean best practice.
I will let the CFO and the auditors speak to national best practice. I can say that when an underspend as low as we have is in part a reflection of trying to be aggressive with our budgets and our planning. It can make year-end close challenging because we will always have overspending. So if you think of in the concept, if everyone spends perfectly their entire budget, there's not funding left over to deal with inevitable overspending.
So am I hearing that as Mr. City Administrator, you would wish we had larger underspending to allow for greater flexibility?
I think it's a good follow-up. What we experienced this year was an aggregate about what we were able to absorb given some of the spending pressures we also had to resolve.
And is there a best practice nationally?
Best practice for a target or an expectation of underspend? I don't believe so. I think it depends on the appetite for a jurisdiction for risk. Or appetite for a jurisdiction and its elected leaders to be in the detail of managing departments.
Understood.
And so for
But
folks.
I'm
yeah.
sensitive to what the city administrator offered in that, yes, we do want to get dollars out the door,
Mhm.
but in doing so and getting that number smaller allows less flexibility for us to
Absolutely.
absorb
Absolutely.
inevitable issues that arise.
They always arise in my
Yes.
experience. And I'd argue when the economy is slowing, as it is right now, there are more issues that arrive than when times are good. Maybe there's less stress on your systems, less on your programs that you're providing, and for a variety of reasons. And so it feels like one follows the other. As your margins become tighter, the surprises become more significant, and for a variety of correlated issues to a slowing of an economy.
Understood. Mr. Lee, so you refinanced the district's bonds, which in part allowed for us to make a generous offer to Monumental Sports. Can you briefly just detail what that process is and what is our current capacity with the bond cap?
Sure, I'll describe the process. At least once a year, we go to the market to borrow money to pay for capital expenses that are approved in your capital improvement program plan. It takes us months to prepare for those sales. And that's because you have to work with your underwriters. You have to put together several very complicated legal documents, because in the end, this is a contract, or hundreds of contracts, if you will, that you're signing. And so it's a large effort that takes a lot of planning. We had anticipated, and in the end, what drives when you sell depends on your cash
Yes.
balance. And so we anticipated that we needed to have a major sale in November to restock our cash from capital spending that's going on. And so we began planning that process probably, we knew about it in March, probably in earnest in late spring. And so it took us months to
And that
execute.
brought, or can you speak to our capacity to borrow as a result?
Right. So that's the outcome of the sale. We were very fortunate in that the market in the week we had planned to sell moved very much in the favor of issuers like ourselves. So that means interest costs that we would face went down dramatically. It had to do with higher.
Understood. And then capacity.
And then capacity means if in general, we spend less on our
No, I
debt.
know what capacity, but like, what is our ability to borrow? And what I'm getting
Yeah.
at is
How much
because of
was
the money
wa-
that we put on the table, a lot of residents said, well, if you can find $500 million to offer Monumental Sports, why can't you do X, Y, Z? And I think it's important for residents to understand the process, but
Right.
also what our capacity is as a result of that refinance.
Right. Our estimates is the capacity that we created in the time horizon was north of 600 million, probably close to 700 million. But be clear, it's then not mine to decide how that is utilized.
Understood.
Councilmember Ricker,
Understood. Well, thank you. I am over time.
Councilmember Robert White.
Can I just, I'm sorry, Chairman,
Yes,
can
sure.
I add one thing to that? Because I just want to be clear, by the time the budget gets transmitted to council, that could change for a couple different reasons. If the revenue forecast goes down or expenditures go down tremendously, that's going to lower the amount that we can borrow because it's based on expenditures. If interest rates go up. So I just don't want that number out there as like, you will necessarily see that because there's so much that's going to happen between now and when we deliver the budget. That is true today. It may not be true by the time we submit in March.
Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Chairman. Just want to touch on one thing that's come up a couple times, and this is the DC Housing Authority audit. In the Budget Support Act last year, I added a requirement of an Act for Style audit to happen annually for the DC Housing Authority. So the information the auditor is pointing to will come to us in full, and that is what we need annually. I don't know that it's our biggest concern where it goes. The information is important, but it does matter where it goes because I think to the CFO's point, the district does not want to adopt responsibility for debts of a massive housing authority that we don't control. And so that could, I think, have some really devastating impacts on the district's finances. But I do want folks to know, long before the auditor's audit on this issue, we had already required that this type of audit happen. I want to get into where our economy is heading in clarity there. In the act for Mr. CFO, you talk about there are you look at vacancy rates, which are about 15.7%, and I think that's citywide. What's your projection for leases in the financial plan? Commercial leases.
Yeah, we don't project leases per se, but rather we're estimating that there'll be vacancies, which would be unleased properties that will likely reach between 25 and 27% by fiscal year 2027. So well over a quarter of leasable properties will not be earning income. We take that information, then estimate what that means to assess value processes that we have. And then that leads to our estimate for property tax revenues.
Okay. And so that's vacancy. Vacancy and occupancy are a little different. I can lease a space, but doesn't mean I'm in there physically.
That is correct.
How do you project occupancy of commercial buildings? Which I would imagine has to be projected somewhere because with sales taxes, we have to predict what type of sales taxes, for instance, there will be downtown.
Right.
And that is in part impacted by the number of people who are downtown. So how do you make those calculations?
So that we're both clear on the terms. Occupancy means who's in a building today versus what is being paid to lease a space, whether it's used or not.
Right.
We focus on the latter because that determines in the end what an assessed value will be. Whether or not a firm is leasing space and they're paying for it and paying for it forever, whatever the time the lease is good for, but they're choosing not to utilize it or occupy it, that's not a forecast that we make. We do know through reader card information, we do track reader card, meaning the security access cards that we all use to get into locked buildings. We track what utilization is or occupancy is from that perspective, and we routinely report on what that is for the district. It's, around 50%.
Okay.
So, but that's different than making forecasts for the actual economic activity that goes on in the building, specifically the leases and how long they'll last and the payments. So we estimate the amount of property that will in effect not be earning or have lease income.
That makes sense. But how do you then project sales and use tax, which is a major part of our revenue stream?
I think it depends on the different industries. I know it does. For example, if you're worrying about our taxes related to hospitality in particular, there's different kind of economic variables and some relatively more national variables that will give you an idea of how occupancy in hotels will fare out and therefore what revenue we'd receive. General sales tax, the general part of it, that's not a specific industry, but rather everything else, if you will, is more tied to personal income in the region as well as in the district in particular. So it depends on two or three different, what particular industry you're forecasting on. And I don't know how many different forecasts you make. I know some jurisdictions will split up their sales tax into maybe 4 or 5 different industries and forecast them separately. So where there's a lot of development, your development is subject to sales tax, then of course you're spending a lot of time forecasting development activity and development spending. So we segregate out the most important standalone industries, and the rest would just generally follow our economic estimates of personal income growth and so forth.
Okay. Well, then let me go back to leases and vacancies. So if the projection is that vacancies could go, I think you say around 25% is the projection.
Mm-hmm.
Do you calculate a ripple effect on, does that include property tax? So essentially, if, what we're hearing from building owners is at some point, we're going to hand over the keys to the bank. That obviously would have a financial impact to the city. How do you project whether or not buildings will end up being vacated, going into bankruptcy, and how that would impact the city's funds?
So, as I said, we focus on vacancy rates and also transactions that are occurring that we know about, or ownership transfers. And those are some of the driving forces then that lead us to understanding the trajectory of assessed values. So as more and more properties change ownership simply because they're going from the holding company who's given the key to the lender, those are transactions we understand. That affects our estimates of that building and other buildings, similar situated buildings. So we watch transactions, including those kind of transactions, as well as leasing data.
Okay. Again, as I said earlier, one really good sign, population is increasing. Is this primarily like births, international migration, in-migration nationally? Do you get into that detail of where the population growth is coming from?
We get in the detail that's provided by the Census Bureau.
Okay.
And as we've reported, there seems to be relatively more immigration of international folks as opposed to US citizens.
Okay.
We're not sure what that means economically
Mhm.
or what that means to the district, but we are seeing that. I can't tell you specifically what share of that growth is for that, but we're certainly of people have that those attributes, but we certainly are seeing that as a
Okay.
reality. And we'll see what that means if that changes our economic expectations from population growth.
Last question, because of time. So again, population is going up. The home sales, at least for the 3-month period that ended in September of 23, were down 11.93%. Do you have an idea of whether that's because of supply of homes on the market for sale because of the increase in costs or increase
I think there's a
borrowing
couple,
rates?
I'm sorry.
Please.
I think there's a couple of reasons. Just importantly, interest rates are high. So that has a dampening effect on demand because it costs more to own the same square foot unless prices have come down enough, and they have not. I think the other issue is the one that Councilmember Henderson brought up, and economists speculate there is stickiness, if you will, of people who have something very small they're not happy with, but they're paying 2.5% to 3.5% mortgage on, a reluctance to get a bigger house that's 6% mortgage, 5.5%, is very expensive in addition to just facing a higher rate. So they can live comfortably with an owned property and so they tend to stick with that property longer. It's hard to prove that, but that's certainly a common thought amongst real estate economists.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Lewis George was next on the list, but I don't think she's here online. And I'm saying that so that she can reveal herself. So then the next council member would be Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our witnesses. I have anecdotal evidence of the stickiness issue. I think that's a thing that's happening with my daughter. So, so I do think that that's a phenomenon out there. I want to ask you about a couple of small things and then kind of try to have you walk me through so I understand a big thing. One of the things on the sales tax revenue, it sounded like you look at the different components of it to some extent. To what fraction of the $2 billion in sales tax do you think comes from restaurants? Ballpark. I'm not going to tie you to it, but
You know what? Stop. We publish it, so and maybe before the hearing's over with, I can give you that.
all right, great. Then on the pensions, are the pension valuations based on September 30th, 2023? So that when I see the numbers for how fully funded they are, is that based on a date?
I believe it's January 1st, but
2023.
Yes, the latest January 1st from whenever the report is published from the actuary, but I'm not sure. Typically, it's January 1st, even for jurisdictions that are not calendar year fiscal affairs, but we'll find out very
Okay,
specifically.
I mean, the reason that I raise it is one of the things that we may need to do is replenish at least one of those funds, but it could be the valuation is quite different. The market has moved quite a lot and pension funds hold assets that could have appreciated, so that could change that picture.
It could, but it's unlikely. And the reason for that is that, especially in the retirement world, you don't look at your market value, you look at a weighted average of the value over a time period. And so certainly when you have a dramatic upswing or downswing, that'll affect your value. But if it's small, and we're in a very volatile time for financial assets, when it's small shifts, it may not really affect dramatically as you're suggesting.
Certainly not one.
And so Yes, so that is that's the way to think about the asset side. It is true here, as it is in all systems, that there is an expectation that once you fall under the 100% funding level, that not only do you pay what you need to for services or benefits that's just been earned by employees in the current year, but you pay a little bit back in addition to make up the difference. And that's based on assuming you won't have the big, large spike in asset value. So that's two different components, a normal cost and then this actuarial cost to make up for your unfunded liability. And in the district, we expect to pay back, certainly for OPEB, I believe it's true for the retirement system, what we don't have. In other words, to get to 100% over a 15-year period. And so our rates that we contribute each year have both components, what's currently being earned, as well as the share needed that year to ensure by 15 years from now that the fund will be at 100%. And then, of course, you know, as we all do, we hope for dramatic upturns in the market over 3 or 4 years, and it'll make up a lot of it on itself.
And so, I mean, every year we do this kind of effort at truing up. Do we look like we're in a deeper hole this year than in previous years? Because we would have done this in last year's budget because as a part of truing up, is it worse next year? Or is it like it's been?
It's likely to be the same for both. It, like your mortgage, it takes a while before you start paying principal. That is out of left field comment. But the bottom line is, as you start paying back into the system, actuaries will tell you it takes a time to catch up. And so you may go 4 or 5 years where your funding ratio does not materially change. But in year 6, 7, 8, and then by 15, you're making large strides to pay back what you lost with the market loss so that you will be at a full 100% ratio.
I guess I'm getting a little stuck on this, but I guess, I mean, what I was hearing was that in the budget for FY25, we may need to take dollars and contribute them to.
It's already inherently part of your financial plan.
And
there's
is it
nothing-
different?
There's nothing in this report that would change what's in the financial plan, or if it
Neither.
is, it's very, very minor.
Neither pushing it up or pushing it down. We would
I
stay
don't
on the
believe
same
so. I
track.
believe it's
Okay,
generally on
that's what I was-
target from the
That's
financial
what I
plan.
was trying to get at. On the capital side and Councilmember Parker's questions about capacity and Director Reed. One question to you, CFO Lee, is what interest rates assumptions are you thinking about? How do the interest rate assumptions that you're thinking about now for the FY25 budget compare to the interest rate assumptions that you'd built in for FY24? Because to the extent that they come down,
Right.
they increase
Right.
capacity.
They're materially the same because the Federal Reserve Board has not changed rates in several months now. And they, again, just signaled yesterday that they don't plan to do dramatic changes, at least in the next several quarters or a couple of quarters.
So you.
So
expect it
we
to
don't
be-
have a basis to change. Now, certainly we'll look at our market activity. But yes.
And so, Director Reed, I guess I was a little startled when you said that the capacity could go down. Is it your expectation that expenditures for FY25 and going forward will be lower than they have been in previous years, or City Administrator Donahue?
We will balance our budget and you'll balance your budget based on a February revenue estimate. In that time, the CFO could come in and have lower projected revenues that would trickle down into lower projected spending. So our capacity is based on a number of things. A principal one is how much are we expected to spend out of local revenue sources over the course of our financial plan. So if there is a impact, say, of increased office vacancies to lower value commercially, particularly downtown, that the CFO comes with a lower fiscal estimate for February, it absolutely would mean a change and reduction in the capital capacity that we'd have.
I'm gonna go back a second on the interest rates because I hear you on what the Fed has done, but there's also what the market does. And do you account for that? Because you had, I mean, dramatically the experience that rates came down and in the market rates are lower. So that does that affect, or is that where there could be?
Sure,
small
we look
changes?
at we look at the market, yes. And other factors. Appreciate, we were profoundly fortunate in having at the last sale, having dramatically good macroeconomic data come out the day that we anticipated to sell. As a result, actually the day before, we moved the sale up by a day to take advantage of this. As a result, interest rates that were available to us were dramatically less than we anticipated. They've since recovered a bit. So we were extraordinarily lucky and have a really good team that was prepared to move.
One of the things that you have warned me about, and I think probably warned everybody under the sun, is if there doesn't look like there's a solution for WMATA, that you would have to account for that in whatever revenue estimate you did in February. I think the prospects of that look increasingly optimistic, at least in the short term, but it's not in black and white everywhere. Where are you at in your thinking about how you might need to account for WMATA in your revenue estimate?
We believe that there's critical meetings between now and when we do our forecast that may give us a sense of very specifically what fiscal year 25 looks like with WMATA. The same time we're evaluating our options. If suddenly 50% of the service is not available, we have to be able to react to that. So it's way too early for us to speculate.
So, but there is time between now and when you issue your estimate that you can have meetings that you
Right,
can get
and
the
I-
level of assurance that you need.
I understand there's some critical meetings that will be public with WMATA upcoming that may bring clarity.
All right, help us on that. Thank you.
Thank you. There'll be a second round. Also, Mr. Chief Financial Officer, if the mayor wants to spend money on, let's say, SNAP benefits, does that have to be appropriated?
Can you explain more what you mean by that?
No, it's a simple question.
All
I am
spending
going
requires
somewhere.
an appropriation.
It does require an appropriation. So if we want to, if she wants to spend more money on SNAP benefits, it has to be appropriated. If she wants to spend more money on an existing program, say Department of Building Inspectors, it has to be appropriated.
If it's more than is appropriated already, and you'll either have a reprogramming or a supplemental to change the appropriation capacity of that particular program area.
Okay, I won't belabor that too much. So there was $419 million in surplus.
Mhm.
And I'm guessing the way that 419 got used up was entirely the waterfall of the reserves. Is that correct?
Largely, yes.
And the primary place that it went was contingency, to bring the contingency back up. Is that correct?
A large portion of it repaid the contingency.
Like maybe 300 million?
I don't believe it was that much, but a substantial amount.
Well, my estimates are that contingency as of third quarter last year. Is there a reason why it takes so long for us to get these contingency reports from you? The one for the third quarter that ended June 30th was given to us 3 months later. So we don't have the one for the fourth quarter. Do you know
Duly
why they're
noted.
so late?
Duly noted. Look at that.
But as of June 30th, the balance in contingency was 63.9 million. And as of September 30th, it's 368 million, which is $300 million higher. That says to me at least 300 million was spent out of contingency last year.
You could be right, but let me defer to,
Well, before we go there, I want to understand why. So for example, and this is looking at the quarterly letter we get, the contingency cash reserve fund may be used for non-recurring or unforeseen needs that arise during the fiscal year, including natural disasters, unexpected obligations created by federal law, new public safety or health needs identified after the budget process has occurred. I'm thinking like COVID, which was certainly a new public health need that occurred after the budget was. So that's reading from your letter, but I'm guessing that's pretty much paraphrasing the law. So like the pandemic relief, and not pandemic, the migrants, which I think is somewhere around $11 million a month roughly. Maybe it's a little bit less, $7 million a month. But that's a recurring expense. Shouldn't at some point it stop being paid out of contingency and be paid out of a supplemental budget? Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot.
Yes.
So because the effect of this is that
Right.
who appropriates the budget? Isn't it the council?
Right. So I understand.
Well, that was a yes or no.
Yeah.
Isn't it the council that appropriates the budget? The mayor has to sign it, but the council's the one, we're the appropriators, right?
That is true.
Okay, and what's the law regarding contingency reserves? That they have to be repaid.
Yes, they do.
So if the executive spends contingency, we have to pay that. Now, we don't get to choose. We don't get to choose whether that money is going to unanticipated closing costs in DEMPED or sign language services in the Department of Human Services or summer readiness work orders or paid family leave. I really don't get that one since there is a fund, a special purpose fund for that. We don't get to make those choices, but we do. In fact, we don't even have a choice that the money has to be repaid to contingency. And the fact is that the reason why cash flow is fiscal stabilization is at 12% is because the surplus of 419 got used up before it got to fiscal stabilization. It got used up at contingency. And I'm stuck on the non-recurring, which wouldn't be the monthly migrant services, or unforeseen needs, which I guess you could say unanticipated closing costs in DEMPED were unforeseen because of poor planning. But I don't think that's what this means. It doesn't say unforeseen needs due to poor planning. So how do we stop this?
So I think because of the experience for fiscal year 23 in not having, for the first time in many years, enough surplus from the fiscal year to replenish each of these reserves, it is time to pause and understand that this practice in general. Now, at the same time, the codes are what they are in terms of who has access to these resources, but I am concerned that we now have a budget in a slowing economy that did not provide the surpluses to refill or replenish each of these funds. And I believe there is discussions to be had with both the executive and the council and our office to understand how we want to manage these resources moving into this year and next and throughout the financial plan.
Well, when we had rising revenues
Yes.
above the projections, then this wasn't as an acute issue, but
That
it
is
was
correct.
an issue nonetheless.
Yes.
Because the money still is required by law, but you are required to replenish the reserves out of the surplus.
Mhm.
And we don't have a choice. That's a spending. That's an expense that we did not appropriate. We did not appropriate that. It doesn't get appropriated until we have to act on the next budget with regard to replenishment. And that was a problem when the revenues were going up. It's just that now the revenues aren't going up, so we actually see a hole.
Mhm.
If the revenues were going up, I might still be asking these questions today because that $419 million, let's just say that $419 million was on top of revenue growth. We could use that to spend when we have the budget, or the mayor could use it to propose to spend when she submits the budget, but that option has been taken away from us. So who reviews and says that these contingency draws meet the law? Who does that?
We review what's presented us with, from the executive. And certainly, to your point, evaluating how we collectively manage these resources and this spending is a worthwhile endeavor, especially as you're pointing out, because we're likely in for several years of having substantially less surpluses than we.
So let me
So-
be clear. I think the migrant services, we need to pay the migrant services. We are a caring community, and it is really unfair what the governors in Texas and elsewhere are doing to
Right.
these migrants who, as I understand it, don't even know what's happening to them. And yeah, we should spend that money. But really, if it's recurring, it's no longer unexpected.
Mhm.
And if it's recurring, we should have a supplemental.
So Chairman, if I could
Hold on a
jump in
second,
here.
Mr. Chief Financial Officer.
I'm sorry?
We should have a supplemental because it's recurring. It's no longer unexpected. Do we expect migrants next month?
I think the broader point you're making is valid. It is clearly a time to think about these processes related to use of the contingency, in particular, maybe fiscal stabilization as well. And I concur that it is time to evaluate this, especially in addition, not only are we in a slower economy, we are as planned, liquidating surpluses that have accumulated over 4 or 5 years over the next 4 years, so that the reserves we do have are ever more important to support not only cash flow, but also to prop us up for true emergencies.
I'll recognize Ms. Reed in a second, but let me ask the auditor, do you look at this issue at all? Mr. Kozlik?
Do we look at the way in which money's spent?
No,
By the
the
mayor's
decision
office?
making over drawing from the contingency reserves, because the law is clear, has to be, let me get the language again. It has to be non-recurring or unforeseen needs that arise during the fiscal year, including natural disasters, unexpected obligations, I'll repeat, unexpected obligations created by federal law, new public safety or health needs identified after the budget process has occurred, and revenue shortfalls. You don't look at that at all.
No, we would look to see that the expenditure was paid and went out the door and was reflected in the financial statements.
But you do look at, for instance, whether contracts got all the approvals that were necessary.
Correct.
Ms. Reed,
Thank you,
I
Chairman.
wasn't gonna ignore you totally.
Thank you. So there's a couple things I want to add to this discussion. First of all, the use of contingency cash by the executive is based in the Home Rule Act. Secondly, there was not 300 million needed to be repaid by the $416 million surplus. 135 million of our total contingency use was for COVID. The majority of that, 90%, was reimbursed by FEMA. 45 million was migrant services, which at the time we were hoping and anticipating that the federal government would step up. As you pointed out, they haven't. We have already spoken with the CFO that you will see a migrant services budget when you get the supplemental budget this year. The remaining 188 was used for a variety of other unforeseen needs, some of which what we had used by March was repaid in the supplemental we submitted to you. The rest was repaid at the end of the year. So it was far less than 300 million.
Well, those
I would
different
also like to
components you
add-
just gave add up to more than 300 million.
We used 368 million over the entire course of the fiscal year. The last point I would like to make is the reason for the reserves being full is not solely due to the use of contingency cash. There are two other main reasons why the reserves were not filled: historic levels of underspending, the lowest in a decade, and the other component we use is future revenues. The council passed a law at the end of the budget this year that redirected 60 million of those revenues for new expenditures. that also lessen the amount that would go into the reserves.
Sure. That doesn't change my line of questioning, which is 360 million. How much did you say again? The total was spent from contingency?
368.
Yes. And I totally get that if there's an expenditure that you expect that the federal government's going to reimburse, maybe that's okay. But not all of it. That's less than half. Now, I mean, I only have the last quarter report, but somewhere in here, why does DEMPED get by with unanticipated closing costs?
Unfortunately, Chairman, the budget is not a static document. Once you all pass it, things happen and we have to be able to respond to
Like
those
bad
needs.
planning, maybe? Because there should not be unanticipated closing costs in DEMPED. And if there are, then they should be able to reprogram within the agency to cover it, instead of drawing from the piggy bank to supplement or to pay for their poor calculation. Or how about I'm going to get in trouble if I go over it, because there's a reason for all of these, some of the reasons I would not agree with. And so I don't know, why 7 million for paid family leave when there's a paid family leave fund that's separate? You don't need to draw from contingency reserve.
So all of those uses were for unforeseen things that happen throughout the fiscal year. Sometimes we are able to reprogram, sometimes they occur in such a short time frame. The reprogramming process would take too long.
Well, but the law is, we are the appropriators, correct? And there is a reprogramming process that goes to the council for approval if it's over $500,000, but that's avoided. And you just said sometimes that's cumbersome. And then there's also the supplemental budget route. And I get it that the custom is we only do a supplemental budget in March, but we don't have to only do it in March. The code doesn't say that. The code says that if there is things change, to quote you, if things change, you can send a supplemental budget. You don't want to because you don't want to open up the budget, but there are processes other than the contingency reserve fund, which is a unilateral decision by the non-appropriators in the government, which then we have to pay. And that's just, as the chairman of the legislative branch, that's just not acceptable.
Mr. Chairman, the premise of the line of questioning here is that there are inappropriate uses of the COVID, of the contingency fund. Each and every transaction is reviewed by the OCFO for compliance with the law, and the contingency appropriation authority is in the Home Rule Act. So when you read the top line of a reason and then suggest that it's an inappropriate application of it, I would just challenge that basic premise you're putting forward. Why does do change? If the council is contemplating trying to limit the ability of agencies to be able to make adjustments when there's issues of life, safety, and health in the line, there's going to be very practical and real operational consequences that you cannot speed up your supplemental or reprogramming process to be able to keep up with the needs. that
I
we
know,
have.
but I would not characterize, please, I would not characterize sign language interpretation services as life, safety, or public health. And I would not characterize unanticipated closing costs, which was $7.6 million, as life, safety, or public health.
If we have a legal.
And what about HPAP? That's on this list twice in the third quarter. I don't know about the fourth, second, or first. And in the third quarter, it is $24 million to HPAP.
Every transaction gets reviewed and approved. In the case of
And I'm
HVAP, there was-
questioning that. And I didn't say that you are, how did you phrase it? Inappropriate. I said, I don't believe this is a correct reading of the law. And I think that the CFO should be saying no to these requests. You can request away, but I don't. This is a public hearing. The public gets to watch this. I hope they're listening. I don't consider closing costs, which I assume is a development project, to be non-recurring or unforeseen needs that arise, such as natural disasters, unexpected obligations created by federal law, new public safety or health needs identified after the budget process.
You absolutely can have an unexpected expense and need in an area in which you are diminishing an area's ability to have that. You can have an unexpected need in sign language interpretation services, particularly if there's a law that compels us to have it.
You know,
And there's not
whenever,
funding
whenever
available.
there's an expense that you didn't expect, it's an unexpected need that doesn't justify going around the appropriation process. And in addition, a budget is a plan and a good plan. I am way over my time and I will not be forgiven for this.
Mr. Chairman, we spent 99% of our appropriated dollars. I'd hardly call that a poorly planned budget execution.
Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to the line of questioning that I dropped off, I think, I don't know, 6 council members ago, which was about the labor market. So we've seen our unemployment numbers go down. In your presentation, you talk about income taxes grew by 2% because of a rebounding labor market. As I was saying, in 2021, which was my first year on the council, it was noted that upper income individuals mitigated some of the lost revenue and income taxes from service sector employees who many saw their jobs lost during the pandemic. Are we still seeing this type of income stratification, or is the comeback of employment opportunities, are we seeing some equality, well, equality is not the right word, but some similar levels across various types of labor?
In the time period you're describing, so 2021, nationally, we saw profound capital gains. And so for higher income folks, that matriculates into a relative increase in personal income tax that we received. And that's true generally for most jurisdictions that have robust income tax. So we're not in that time period now. Those gains, well, clearly there are some occurring, are not at the same rate.
So I guess my question, let me rephrase. In terms of where we're seeing increases in the labor market, is it similarly happening in what they might consider white collar jobs, or are our largest increases being driven by service sector and hospitality or hourly work?
I think it's generally across the board. We publish this in our forecast. We can provide a detailed information by sector. The notable exception is the number of employees that are federally employed has dropped and continues to drop. Otherwise, we're seeing rebounds that are fairly constant, but we'd be happy to describe that in more detail by sector. I'm happy to provide that.
Okay. Similarly related, yet a little bit different. So Mr. Lee, we were at an event together this weekend, and there was a conversation, a presentation around looking at some research that the DC Policy Center had done of DC doing really well with 25 to 35-year-olds, but we tend to lose higher income earners as they go from earning income to earning wealth. So once they start to hit that $150,000 mark, then we're starting to see some drops in terms of population. How concerned should we be about that as we go forward and sort of thinking about all of our comeback plans and action plans and plans for the plans for the plans?
I think losing any component of our population is problematic. But I also think there are some very significant forces that are underway that weren't true 8 years ago, 5 years ago. And that is if a lot of people in that category can now work 3 to 5 days a week in a home environment, the benefit of being closer to work, living in the central city is gone down. And that is something that is observed across the economy, across the country. And so right now, that could be that just how a permanent hybrid environment, which it feels like we're walking into right now, or coming to a point where the current practices are fairly permanent, will cause on the margin more and more people that can afford to leave and may want more space per square foot to not worry about the commutes that would have been impossible to deal with if everyone was working in an office
Right.
5 days a week. So
Okay.
economists speculate that that is a huge driver of outmigration of city centers around the country.
I feel like we're having like a economist nerd conversation here. So I'll go to something a bit more specific on a different topic. This is great, Mr. City Administrator, to have you and the CFO here about this particular topic, because I don't ever think that both of you are at a hearing at the same time. And I'm going to ask you about something as we talk about the future projections, even if we're looking in the past, sports betting. This was an area where there were higher expectations in terms of the amount of revenue that was going to be coming to the district. And when I look around and I'm looking at, you know, as you guys are providing in terms of your reports and the revenue forecast, I got to find new revenue somewhere to sort of make up for some of the things that we're seeing in our commercial sector now. And I feel like that's an area, except for, I feel like there's also some hesitation on the part of, the agencies involved to perhaps make a change. So I'll ask this. Mr. CFO, are you satisfied with what has been happening in terms of sports betting revenue and the deployment
Well,
of?
Put it in the context to the original documents that I've seen that when we were contemplating this, that there's no doubt that the revenues did not live up to those expectations. This is a difficult market to be in. And I know we're actively, as was in a prior hearing on this matter in the last couple of weeks, we're actively looking with our contractor to see if there's options for a different platform within that contract that
Or a different contractor?
that is always an option.
Okay.
It's always an option. So, but we have to be very open to what will be expedient and improve this experience. And we certainly want to. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
So
Mr. C-
we're keeping all of our options on the table and
Okay, Mr. City Administrator, I'll ask you the same question here.
Thank you for the question. Obviously, this is a program that's managed by the OCFO. It's one that the mayor asked me to work with the CFO to understand more about the adjustments that they're planning for in the short term. The policy priorities that I see it with regard to this area, first is, at first we have to think, why do we have sports betting and what's its societal purpose? If the purpose is in part to raise revenue, we first have to have a better consumer experience for those that are using it, and a change in platform will facilitate that. Second, there has to be an adjustment made to be able to ensure that some of the unpredictability is mitigated, so there's not years in which we lose revenue. And third, we have to recognize with their unique design, there is an income generation opportunity that's realized by a lot of small businesses in which the cash components of this may make up a meaningful part of their own monthly revenue stream. And that sort of sometimes allows them to be able to make rent. So those are the three policy principles that the mayor asked us to work with the CFO on. They're making some short-term adjustments that I think preserve that. I think that your question leads to this longer-term question, which is the overall global contract is up, I believe, at the end of next fiscal year. So, which you may correct me on. So there's an opportunity in the medium term to be able to look at what this should look like for the next tranche of 5 years.
I'm glad that it's on your radar. I think given, you know, the conversation around monumental sports and just the general lack of, I would say, regionalism I'm feeling lately with my colleagues in Maryland and Virginia as they try to poach our revenue, whether it be sports teams, businesses that are moving, all of the various things, is that we have to think about how all of these various pieces are playing into the overall ecosystem of people feeling as though the district is a good place to do business and the district is a good place for competition for business to happen. The final thing I wanted to talk about was this slide, Mr. CFO, not CFO, sorry, the CA on slide 8 about our COVID funding ending. Now, I feel like for all the various, we've been talking about this for forever, but I don't feel like the community necessarily believes you all. And so my question, particularly when I'm looking at this ESSER funding, I know what's going to happen when you all submit that budget in March in terms of what the school funding might look like. But I don't feel like you all are appropriately setting the expectations for the community around what to expect of how we are supposed to come up with $600 million in local dollars to continue everything we've been doing. When do those conversations start?
Well, to add some urgency even to your question, the school budgets are often submitted before the overall budget submission for the city on March 20th. So we're actively involved in that. I was with the mayor out in community just last week, where we had about 20 WTU members and some parents actively participating. And she really set the expectation that we're shifting into a new phase, that much of our federal funding has dried up and we have to be able to make choices. I think the question for the council, and this is what I tell every council member, is that, and I have been in serving as city administrator in a recession. You can get through it when there is some clarity and consensus about what's most important among many important things. So at the time of the recession in 2008 to 2010, there was a collective decision that public education was going to be number one. It doesn't mean it's the same now. So while we were having profound cuts, layoffs in government, we were able to preserve certain budgets because collectively we decided here are some areas that we want to make sure aren't harmed and we grow despite the recession. So as we all work together for the budget, including education, public safety, downtown, human services, I think over the past few years, everyone was able to get some of what they wanted. Now the math just won't work out. And the more clarity we collectively have between the executive and the legislature about what is most important to focus on, the better we'll be able to communicate to the public and make sure we're preserving the essential pillars of the city's value system as we finalize at the end of this, later in this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions. On underspending, when I looked through and looked by agency at underspending, it looked two big ticket items were OSSI, which it looked like $363 million in underspending, and fire and emergency services, something like $80 million in underspending. Can you help me understand how numbers like that could have happened, what that's all about?
Sure. So for both of those agencies, the underspending is in federal funds. And it's not necessarily that they didn't spend all of the money that they planned to. In the case of OSSI, that is all federal grants. And basically it's childcare grants. It's they're ones where they load and there's a 3 or 4 year commitment. So they're planned to be spent over time, but they're loaded in 1 year so they can make the full grant amount. And then they slowly get spent down. And we can provide a breakout of those. FEMS is actually budget authority that is just there. Those expenditures go to healthcare finance for Medicaid reimbursements. So it's just excess budget authority that's there. It's not real money.
Okay. On the population, one of the things is the growth, to the extent that we have it, is international migration. I think it's also more births than deaths, as I recall. But on the international migration side, do the buses figure into that? Are the folks who are being shipped up here by the governors of Florida and Texas?
We don't know.
You don't know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious about that because I'll circle back. I guess now, and the chairman was going through this in a different sort of way, and I have a feeling you have yet one more round with the chairman, but maybe you can help me. I'm trying to understand the total surplus was 988 million when I look at it. And then it's 816 million that is the local budget surplus. And there's 166 million that is something else. What is that 166 million?
It'll take me a minute to track specifically, but my guess is if you were looking at general fund, that Part of that was special purpose revenues.
I think it's page 177 of your book. And
We'll give you that answer in a second. Let's look it up.
so want to understand, where's that money go? Is it sitting someplace? Is it into another fund that's not one of the reserve funds or?
Right. So those are reflect resources and spending for that are not taxes or other general fungible money, but rather very specific revenues that are affiliated with an operation of a department. And so inherently, that means that savings there or growth in fund balance would mean that those resources were not spent, but are still dedicated to that purpose.
So they're sitting somewhere for use by someone.
I believe so, but
Okay.
yeah, I believe so. But
So then you
yeah.
get to the 816 and this, now I'm
right there.
on
Yep.
your slide
Yep.
10. And the 397 million. So am I right in understanding that those are dollars that turned up in the revenue estimates and then got assigned in a budget process? What are those?
When the fiscal year 23 budget was fully implemented and the revisions made to it, there was an anticipation that there would be 397 million more in revenue than expenses. And that 379 million then would be used in future years to balance the budget. And I would appreciate either Jenny or Jen to confirm, but that's specifically the expectation.
So
Yep.
that's money from 23 that is assigned to be spent in 24,
It's-
25, 26.
And 27, yeah.
And 27. So then you have the 419 million. And then where did that go? Because I think this is, I mean, where did that 419 million go?
Yeah, so a large portion went to refund the contingency reserve that we were just describing. As
But I heard a
well,
whole bunch of different numbers and it didn't
Right.
sound like it was how,
Right.
yeah, you say a large portion. Can you tell me how much of it?
well, in the end, it was out of the waterfall process, it was about 180 to $200 million.
Okay, so that's 180, 200
Right.
million that, so
In
then that,
addition-
yeah, go ahead.
In addition, council appropriated $60 million.
All right, now we're 240.
Right. And then there are other adjustments that are made. A key one here is that we use this surplus to fund the growth in the reserves that we need. So in other words, every reserve is tied to spending, your spending amount. If you're spending from one year to the next more money, the reserve requirements go up to replenish them.
So like the
So-
cash flow reserve, the higher amount of
Contingency
cash that
total,
goes up.
yes.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Emergency and so forth. In general, that's the majority of where the 420 million went.
And is there a place where it's broken down, like a chart that you
We
could
can
show?
provide it to you.
I think that would be helpful to me just to make sure that I understand it. But I guess there's a couple of good news pieces that I'm hearing from this. One, that 363 million that OSSI didn't spend with federal grants is still there. And two, the 172 million between the 816 and the 988 is in there in these special funds also perhaps available. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
So.
Yeah.
So I feel like I just found $540 million. So I'll end on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Over the past year, the council has investigated DCPS for its lack of administrative controls over contracts and procurements and failure to obtain council approval prior to contract execution. This issue is also cited as a control deficiency in this year's ACFR. What concrete steps is DCPS and the OCFO taking in its organizational structure, staffing levels, and other dedicated resources to ensure it is in compliance with all rules? I think the "it" in that is DCPS is in compliance with all rules and regulations associated with contracting and procurement. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first, Mr. Chairman. DCPS has really over the past for the better part of a year developed and done training on its standard operating procedures for procurements. That would include and highlight the need to get council approval for contracts over $1 million. They also have more staffing. They have, I believe, 14 staff right now, and they have reduced vacancies. And the principal lead for procurement has a close reporting relationship with the chancellor. That team reports up through Patrick Ashley, who is a direct report to the chancellor, so he has more visibility into it. And I would just add, I believe, and I know the impact and energy that's went into resolving this from DCPS, my office, and OCP over the past few months. The lessons of that are going to be front of mind for the agency in its procedures and in the individuals who lead it.
So you are comfortable that we've reached a point that DCPS can ensure compliance?
We never reach a point of infallibility. I'm comfortable that DCPS's performance will be is substantially better than it was before and consistent with complying with all the rules that they're expected to.
Mr. Lee?
As we've communicated to you earlier, we've adjusted our processes to ensure that we can validate the authorization before we actually transact. And we know that we had processes that had some lapsing, that were not up to speed as much as we'd like to keep on top of these particular transactions with DCPS. And we've made the adjustments. We're comfortable that we're executing what we wanted to execute in terms of being able to keep on top of these transactions. And I'm confident right now that we're not going to have additional issues. Remember, we're on the back end of this process. And so at some level, it's easier for us to make some adjustments to avoid these problems.
So you have a step or steps in place to
Yes, we have.
to review compliance.
Yes. That is more exacting than what we were doing. So we're
Mr. City Administrator, there are 4 open prior year recommendations that are to be fully implemented in FY24. Octo Risk Management Framework, initially reported in 2018. Octo System Vulnerability Scanning and Monitoring, initially reported in 2021. DGS Tracking System for Outlease Revenue, initially reported in 2021. And UDC Information System Risk Management. Can you tell us more about the current status of each implementation effort?
So I can speak to DGS and the 2 Octo projects. I can't speak to UDC right now, but we can get back to you on that. So for DGS, they are in process in terms of standing up the system required for tracking leases. My understanding is this will be completed and it's being done in conjunction with the CFO's office in FY24. For the 2 Octo projects around risk remediation and vulnerability determination, those are 3-year projects that should be wrapping up in FY24. Some of them may carry over into FY25, but all are on track. And I believe, and the auditor can confirm, we've demonstrated and showed that we're working on them, but until they're closed and completed, they remain on the books. But there was always an understanding they would be multi-year efforts to implement.
Multi-year to conclude this fiscal year.
That is the goal, yes.
So let me pursue UDC more particularly. So UDC, according to the briefing package that I got from McConnell Jones, had prior year findings, a total of 3, 2 were implemented, 1 was not implemented. And when I turned the page It says a formalized risk assessment over university's information systems has not been conducted. Status. UDC is still in the process of implementing its risk management framework with full implementation expected in fiscal year 2024. It says initially reported in 2022. So I looked at last year's briefing book, which looks like this, sort of the same, and not the same language, which makes it a little bit difficult, but a formalized risk assessment over UDC systems has not been conducted. And then I look at summary of prior year recommendations. This is last year's report. And it says, develop and implement a process to review and remediate network intrusion detection system. Status, UDC has developed policies and procedures related to intrusion detection system that includes monitoring, detecting, analyzing, and responding to detected events. UDC has not completed implementation and is currently in the process of identifying and implementing thresholds related to intrusion attempts. So I'm not confident that those are the same things last year and this year, but they sound pretty similar. And last year they said they are in the process, and this year they say they're in the process. So why is that okay? And by the way, this year it says initially reported 22, and last year it said initially reported 2021. So it makes me feel like they're kind of just in the process.
I'm not sure those are the same findings. I would have to go back and check, but the finding for this year with regard to the risk management framework, I'm told, should be implemented probably early on in 2024. That's what UDC has communicated to us.
And that might be different than a process to review and remediate network intrusion detection system. That sounds like risk too.
Risks, yes, but I think they're different findings.
Mr. City Administrator, you're comfortable that UDC is going to resolve this?
I certainly will be happy to follow up with UDC. And I would also encourage the council to consider any Budget Support Act amendments the mayor puts forward that would require independent agencies to be able to disclose information to Octo and comply with standards that Octo puts out around risk management and cybersecurity.
That could be carefully crafted, or it could be very broadly written.
I'm sure if we work together, we can figure out the right wording for it.
Thank you. Just a moment. I don't know if this is for you, Mr. Kozlik, or you, Mr. Lucas, but do we have all the documents associated with the ACFR that we should have, management letters, yellow
Yes.
books?
They have all been transmitted to you. Yes.
Everything's out, nothing,
Yes.
nothing more. Are there any additional ACFR related deliverables that we should look for?
No, you have them all. Opinions, management letters, and yellow.
All right, I don't have any other questions. I've been abandoned by my colleagues. Thank you all for your testimony. We usually keep the record open for 2 weeks, so if anybody wants to submit anything for the record, they have until Thursday, 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 15th, 2024. The time is 4:48 p.m. and this hearing is adjourned.